Bergen-Belsen was never meant to be an extermination camp. There were no gas chambers. And yet, by the spring of 1945, more than 70,000 people were dead. This was a place where death arrived quietly, through hunger that never ended, through disease that spread unchecked, through neglect that became deliberate. At first, Bergen-Belsen was a prison camp, a place to hold political prisoners, so-called exchange Jews, and people the Nazi regime believed might still be useful. But as the war collapsed around Germany, the camp was flooded with prisoners evacuated from across Europe. Trains arrived endlessly, food disappeared, sanitation collapsed, and the camp transformed into something far worse than it had ever been designed to be. Here, people did not die in moments. They died over weeks, over months, surrounded by thousands of others doing the same. Tonight, we trace the complete history of Bergen-Belsen, from its creation as a detention camp to its collapse into mass death, to the shock that confronted the world when its gates were opened. This is the story of how a camp without gas chambers still became one of the Holocaust's most haunting symbols. And before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to In&Out Nazi Germany, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Every story, every memory, and every place matters. And together we keep history alive. Now let's begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. The Origins of Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen did not begin as a place of mass death. Its origins were quieter, bureaucratic, and deceptively ordinary, rooted in the early consolidation of Nazi power rather than the later machinery of genocide. In 1940, on a stretch of heathland near the village of Belsen in Lower Saxony, the German military established a prisoner of war camp intended to hold captured soldiers from Poland, France, Belgium, and later the Soviet Union. At this stage, Bergen-Belsen existed outside the core concentration camp system run by the SS. It was administered by the Wehrmacht, governed by military regulations, and framed, at least on paper, as a conventional detention facility under the laws of war. Yet even in these early months, conditions were harsh. Overcrowding, inadequate shelter, and poor sanitation quickly became the norm, especially for Soviet prisoners of war, who were treated not as enemy soldiers but as ideological subhumans. Tens of thousands of them died from starvation, exposure, and disease long before the camp's name became associated with the Holocaust. By 1941, as Germany's war expanded eastward and Nazi racial policy radicalized, Bergen-Belsen's purpose began to shift. The distinction between prisoner of war camps and concentration camps blurred as the SS tightened its grip over all detention systems within the Reich. Soviet prisoners were deliberately excluded from Red Cross protections. Food rations were slashed. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Entire compounds became open-air graveyards. These deaths were not the result of gas chambers or executions, but of systematic neglect, a pattern that would later define Bergen-Belsen's most lethal phase. Death here was slow, administrative, and invisible to much of the German public. In 1943, Bergen-Belsen underwent a decisive transformation. Control of the camp was transferred from the Wehrmacht to the SS Economic and Administrative Main Office, the same bureaucracy that oversaw Auschwitz, Dachau, and the broader concentration camp network. At this moment, Bergen-Belsen was formally incorporated into the Nazi camp system, but with a unique and deeply cynical role. It was redesignated as an exchange camp. The SS planned to hold certain Jewish prisoners as bargaining chips to be exchanged for German citizens held abroad, foreign currency, or political concessions. On paper, this status suggested a degree of protection. Prisoners in the exchange camp were not immediately destined for extermination. Families were sometimes kept together. Some prisoners retained civilian clothing instead of striped uniforms. Hope, fragile and dangerous, was allowed to exist. But this hope was built on illusion. The exchange program was small, inconsistent, and largely unsuccessful. Very few prisoners were ever exchanged. Meanwhile, Bergen-Belsen continued to expand, absorbing new categories of detainees: Jews deported from the Netherlands, Hungary, and Poland, political prisoners, resistance members, Roma, and later evacuees from camps closer to the advancing front lines. Each new arrival strained the camp's already inadequate infrastructure. Barracks designed for hundreds were packed with thousands. Latrines overflowed. Clean water became scarce. Disease found ideal conditions to spread. Unlike camps such as Auschwitz or Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen was not constructed with killing facilities. There were no gas chambers, no crematoria designed for mass murder. But this absence did not make the camp safer. Instead, it created a different kind of killing ground, one where death resulted from collapse rather than execution. Starvation diets, consisting of thin turnip soup and scraps of bread, weakened prisoners until their immune systems failed. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and typhoid spread unchecked. Medical barracks became warehouses for the dying. Guards rarely intervened. The SS understood that neglect could be just as effective as violence. As the war turned decisively against Germany in 1944, Bergen-Belsen's situation deteriorated rapidly. The camp was never designed to hold the tens of thousands who would soon flood into it. Trains began arriving from evacuated camps in the east: Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, Mittelbau-Dora, each transport unloading prisoners already exhausted, sick, and starving. There was no plan to accommodate them, no increase in food, no expansion of sanitation. The camp swelled beyond control, and with it, the death rate soared. What made Bergen-Belsen unique was not a single method of killing, but the absence of restraint. It became a place where the Nazi system simply let people die. Guards no longer needed to enforce order aggressively. Chaos itself did the work. Corpses lay unburied between barracks. Survivors slept beside the dead. Roll calls continued even as prisoners collapsed where they stood. Administration carried on, stamping forms and issuing orders, while the camp dissolved into a landscape of mass suffering. By early 1945, Bergen-Belsen was no longer functioning as any kind of detention center. It had become a terminal point of the collapsing Nazi camp network, a dumping ground for human beings deemed no longer worth transporting elsewhere. Death here was not hidden. It was not secret. It was visible, continuous, and accepted by those in command. Bergen-Belsen had completed its transformation, from a military prison camp into a place of mass death without gas chambers, without execution pits, and without any pretense of survival. This was the beginning of the final phase, and it was already too late for tens of thousands. Chapter 1, Segment 2. The Exchange Illusion and the Growing Camp. By the middle of 1943, Bergen-Belsen occupied a strange and deeply cynical position within the Nazi camp universe. It was no longer merely a prisoner of war camp, yet it was not officially an extermination camp either. Instead, it became something far more deceptive, a place built on administrative illusion. The SS presented Bergen-Belsen as an exchange camp, a holding site for Jewish prisoners who might one day be traded for German nationals abroad, foreign currency, or political leverage. On paper, this status suggested a pause in the machinery of destruction. In reality, it was a delay filled with suffering, uncertainty, and calculated neglect. Prisoners selected for the exchange sections were often told they were fortunate. Some were allowed to keep their civilian clothes. Families were occasionally housed together. Letters were permitted under strict censorship. Compared to Auschwitz or Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen could appear survivable. This appearance was deliberate. The SS understood the power of false hope. A population that believed survival was possible was easier to control than one that knew death was inevitable. Hope, carefully rationed, became another tool of domination. Yet the exchange system was largely a fiction. Only a small number of prisoners were ever released through negotiations, and even these exchanges were inconsistent and politically motivated. Most inmates waited for months or years as conditions around them steadily worsened. Food allocations were minimal and unreliable. Clothing wore thin. Barracks deteriorated. Medical care was symbolic at best. The SS had no intention of investing resources in a camp whose inhabitants were considered temporary assets or disposable liabilities. As Bergen-Belsen's role expanded, new sections were added to the camp, each with its own rules and hierarchies. There were star camps for Jews who still wore identifying badges, special compounds for prisoners from neutral or Western countries, and later, camps for Hungarian Jews deported en masse in 1944. These divisions created internal stratification, breeding tension and confusion among prisoners, while allowing the SS to manage overcrowding through separation rather than improvement. The camp grew outward, not stronger. Every expansion was improvised, rushed, and under-resourced. Disease began to spread quietly at first. Lice thrived in unwashed clothing. Latrines overflowed. Clean water was scarce, especially during winter. Prisoners weakened by hunger were no longer able to resist infection. Typhus appeared sporadically, then with frightening regularity. The SS response was indifference. Quarantines were inconsistently enforced. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Those too sick to stand for roll call were often left where they lay. Bergen-Belsen was becoming a place where illness, not execution, determined fate. By late 1944, the exchange fiction collapsed entirely. As the Red Army advanced from the east and Allied forces pushed from the west, the SS began evacuating camps closer to the front lines. Bergen-Belsen, located deep within Germany, became a dumping ground for these transports. Trains arrived without warning, unloading thousands of prisoners who were already near death. Many had survived death marches. Others had been packed into freight cars for days without food or water. The camp was never prepared to receive them. Infrastructure failed almost immediately. Barracks designed for hundreds now held thousands. Prisoners slept pressed together on bare floors. Corpses were dragged outside and left unburied because burial details could not keep pace with the dead. Food rations, already insufficient, were diluted further. A thin soup became the primary meal. Bread rations shrank to crumbs. Hunger became constant, gnawing, all-consuming. The SS did not need to increase violence. Bergen-Belsen was killing efficiently on its own. Guards rarely intervened except to enforce roll calls or prevent escapes. The camp had reached a point where chaos functioned as policy. Order existed only in documentation. Prisoner numbers, transport lists, daily reports that continued to move up the administrative chain even as the camp disintegrated. Bureaucracy outlived humanity. For prisoners, time lost meaning. Days blurred into nights. Survival depended on luck, on strength, on finding a scrap of food or a corner of relative warmth. Acts of kindness, sharing a crust of bread, helping someone stand for roll call, became extraordinary risks. Compassion could mean death. Yet even here, in the slow collapse of the camp, such acts persisted. They did not change the system, but they preserved something human within it. By the end of this phase, Bergen-Belsen was no longer defined by its original purpose. The exchange camp had failed. The prisoner of war camp had vanished. What remained was a space where the Nazi system allowed death to proceed unchecked, unhidden, and unchallenged. Bergen-Belsen was becoming what history would later remember it as a place of mass death created not by technology, but by abandonment. The transformation was nearly complete, and the worst was still to come. Chapter 1, Segment 3. the camp that was never meant to survive. By the beginning of 1945, Bergen-Belsen had crossed a threshold from neglect into total collapse. What had once been maintained, however minimally, as a controlled detention space was now a vast, unmanaged human catastrophe. The camp no longer functioned as a place of imprisonment in any meaningful sense. It had become a terminal holding ground, a place where the Nazi system deposited lives it no longer wished to manage, feed, transport, or even officially kill. Death was no longer organized. It was ambient. The SS did not declare Bergen-Belsen a death camp, but they allowed it to operate as one. This distinction mattered only on paper. In reality, the result was the same. Tens of thousands of prisoners were trapped inside a space that had lost all capacity to sustain life. Food deliveries became irregular and then nearly non-existent. Water systems failed. Electrical power flickered or disappeared entirely. Latrines overflowed into living areas. Barracks collapsed under the weight of human bodies packed far beyond design limits. The camp smelled of rot, excrement, sickness, and decay. An odor that survivors later said could be sensed long before the barbed wire came into view. Typhus spread uncontrollably. Lice, thriving in filthy clothing and weakened bodies, carried the disease from person to person with devastating speed. Dysentery followed. Tuberculosis reappeared. Influenza and pneumonia swept through barracks filled with people too malnourished to fight infection. There were no medicines. The camp infirmary, such as it was, had become a waiting room for death. Doctors among the prisoners, many of them highly trained professionals before their arrest, could do little more than offer comfort. They lacked supplies, authority, and sometimes even the strength to stand. The SS response was systematic indifference. Guards did not attempt to restore order or sanitation. They did not isolate the sick. They did not remove the dead promptly. Corpses accumulated inside barracks, in courtyards, along paths. Prisoners stepped over bodies on their way to roll call. Some slept beside the dead because there was nowhere else to lie. Others remained alive only because they were mistaken for corpses and left undisturbed for hours or days. Violence, paradoxically, became less visible. Beatings and executions did not stop, but they were no longer central to the camp's function. Bergen-Belsen did not need brutality to kill. Hunger and disease worked faster, more thoroughly, and without witnesses. The SS had discovered that extermination did not always require direct action. Sometimes it only required abandonment. Administration, however, continued. Paperwork flowed. Daily death counts were recorded, often inaccurately due to the sheer number of bodies. Prisoner lists were updated even as names lost meaning. Transport manifests were prepared for trains that no longer came. Orders were issued that no one followed. The camp existed in a strange bureaucratic afterlife, where the machinery of control outlasted the purpose it once served. For the prisoners, survival became an exercise in minute decisions. Whether to stand or lie down. Whether to trade a shoe for a spoon of soup. Whether to move closer to others for warmth or risk infection by doing so. Strength declined daily. Bodies consumed themselves. Skin tightened over bone. I sank. Speech slowed. Many prisoners described entering a state beyond fear. A numbness where death felt inevitable and effort felt pointless. Yet even here, fragments of resistance endured. Prisoners continued to whisper news from the outside world. Some shared rumors of Allied advances, clinging to the idea that liberation might arrive before death. Others formed small mutual aid groups, pooling scraps of food or helping the weakest stand during roll calls to avoid execution. These acts did not save many lives, but they preserved dignity in a place designed to erase it. Children suffered especially. Many had arrived without parents, orphaned by selections, deportations, or death marches. They were smaller, weaker, more vulnerable to illness. Some were hidden by older prisoners, shielded during inspections, carried when they could no longer walk. Others simply disappeared into the mass of the dying, unrecorded and unmourned. As winter deepened, death accelerated. Thousands died each week. Cremation was impossible. Burial ceased. Bodies were stacked in open pits or left exposed. Snow fell on the dead and living alike. Bergen-Belsen no longer resembled a camp. It resembled the aftermath of a disaster that had never ended. Outside the wire, the war was reaching its conclusion. Allied forces were advancing rapidly across Germany. The SS knew Bergen-Belsen could not be evacuated like other camps. The prisoners were too sick to march. Trains were unavailable. Fuel was scarce. The camp was effectively abandoned, left behind as the regime collapsed around it. By early April 1945, Bergen-Belsen was a place where death occurred not because it was ordered, but because nothing stopped it. The system had succeeded too well. It had stripped life of value so completely that even murder became unnecessary. When British forces finally approached, they were not prepared for what they would find. No intelligence briefing could have captured the reality of Bergen-Belsen in its final state. What awaited them was not a functioning camp, but a vast landscape of human ruin. A place where the Nazi system had revealed its ultimate form. The gates still stood. The guards still wore uniforms. But civilization had already collapsed inside. And history was about to see what abandonment looks like when it is allowed to run its course. Chapter 2, Segment 1. From exchange camp to human dumping ground. Bergen-Belsen did not begin as a place designed for mass death, and that fact makes its transformation all the more revealing. In its early conception, the camp was created not as an extermination center, but as a holding site, an improvised solution shaped by diplomacy, racial ideology, and the shifting needs of a regime at war. Yet the same bureaucratic logic that once framed Bergen-Belsen as useful would later allow it to become one of the most lethal places in the collapsing Nazi system, precisely because it was never meant to endure. The camp emerged in 1940 as a prisoner of war complex on the Lüneburg Heath, a flat, sandy landscape in northern Germany. At first, it held captured soldiers, primarily French and Belgian troops, under the framework of international conventions. Conditions were harsh but structured. There were barracks, ration systems, and at least a minimal recognition that prisoners had some legal status. This early phase created the physical shell that would later be repurposed for something far darker. In 1943, Bergen-Belsen was reassigned a new role. The SS designated part of the camp as an exchange camp, a place where Jews with foreign passports or potential bargaining value could be held for possible exchange with German civilians or prisoners abroad. On paper, this granted certain inmates a temporary reprieve from deportation to the death camps in the East. In reality, it placed them in a suspended state of existence, neither free nor immediately condemned, waiting for negotiations that often never came. This function shaped Bergen-Belsen's early internal hierarchy. Prisoners were divided into subcamps based on nationality, paperwork, and perceived value. Some received marginally better food. Some were spared the worst physical abuse. Families were sometimes kept together. These differences were deliberate. They reinforced Nazi racial classifications while maintaining the illusion that survival was possible through compliance, documentation, or luck. But this fragile structure depended on one condition: that the Nazi system remained capable of control. As the war turned against Germany, that condition vanished. By late 1944, Bergen-Belsen's original purpose had collapsed. Exchange negotiations stalled. The eastern camps, Auschwitz, Majdanek, and others were being overrun or dismantled. The SS began evacuating prisoners westward in massive transports. seeking to remove witnesses and maintain control as territory was lost. Bergen-Belsen, located deep inside Germany and lacking a gas chamber infrastructure, became a destination of convenience. Trains began arriving with little warning. Each transport carried thousands of prisoners, emaciated, sick, traumatized, many of whom had already survived ghettos, selections, forced labor, and death marches. The camp was never expanded to accommodate them. Barracks designed for a few hundred were filled with thousands. Open ground was used for makeshift shelters. Administrative capacity collapsed under the sheer volume of human beings deposited inside the wire. Crucially, Bergen-Belsen was not integrated into the forced labor economy in the way other camps were. It produced little of value for the Reich. Prisoners were not systematically worked to death in factories or quarries. Instead, they were warehoused, kept alive just enough to exist but not enough to recover. This made the camp uniquely dangerous. Without labor quotas to justify rations or medical oversight, prisoners became surplus life, present, contained, and disposable. The SS did not need to issue new orders to kill. Existing policies, neglect, starvation, overcrowding were sufficient. Food allocations were cut again and again as supply lines failed. Water systems were overwhelmed. Sanitation ceased to function. The camp became a closed ecosystem of decay, where disease spread faster than any effort to contain it. What distinguished Bergen-Belsen at this stage was not sadism, but abandonment. Guards still patrolled. Roll calls were still held. Fences remained intact. But the internal logic of the camp had disintegrated. There was no plan for the prisoners' survival, no infrastructure to support them, and no intention to intervene when conditions became lethal. Death was not scheduled. It was inevitable. For the prisoners, this shift was deeply disorienting. Many had learned, through bitter experience, that survival depended on navigating camp systems, securing work assignments, maintaining strength, understanding rules. In Bergen-Belsen, those strategies failed. There was no work to earn food, no hierarchy to climb, no system to exploit. Survival became a matter of endurance alone, measured in days rather than months. Rumors circulated constantly. Some spoke of Allied advances. Others warned that the SS would liquidate the camp before liberation. Prisoners listened for distant artillery, trying to read the war through sound and silence. Time lost meaning. Days blurred together, marked only by hunger and sickness. Yet even in this environment, human relationships persisted. Prisoners shared scraps of bread, traded information, and tried to care for one another when strength allowed. These acts did not alter the outcome for most, but they preserved something essential: the refusal to become entirely what the system intended. Nameless bodies waiting to disappear. By the time Bergen-Belsen entered its final phase, it was no longer an exchange camp, a transit camp, or even a prison. It had become a dumping ground for lives the regime no longer knew how or cared to manage. The Nazi system had not broken down here. It had reached one of its purest expressions, a place where killing occurred without command because the structure itself made death unavoidable. This was the quiet horror of Bergen-Belsen. Not the machinery of gas chambers, but the emptiness of responsibility. Not execution, but erasure through neglect. And as transports continued to arrive, the camp moved closer to a point where survival itself became an exception. What followed would push Bergen-Belsen beyond even the SS capacity to ignore. And the consequences would be visible to the world. Chapter 2, Segment 2. Starvation, Disease, and the Collapse of Human Life. As Bergen-Belsen absorbed transport after transport in late 1944 and early 1945, the camp crossed a threshold beyond which organized survival was no longer possible. What had already become a place of abandonment now transformed into an environment where death spread not through deliberate execution, but through the slow, compounding failures of food, shelter, sanitation, and medical care. This was the phase in which Bergen-Belsen earned its grim reputation, not as a camp of gas chambers, but as a landscape of mass death through starvation and disease. Food was the first system to collapse completely. Rations, already meager, were reduced to a level that could no longer sustain life. Prisoners received watery soup made from turnips, spoiled vegetables, or whatever scraps could be gathered from failing supply lines. Bread rations shrank until they were little more than symbolic. Many days, food did not arrive at all. Hunger became constant, all-consuming, stripping prisoners of strength, clarity, and resistance. Bodies wasted rapidly. Legs swelled from edema, faces hollowed, teeth loosened. Men and women who had survived years of persecution elsewhere began to die within weeks of arrival. The hunger was not accidental. The SS knew exactly how little food was entering the camp. They saw the effects daily. But Bergen-Belsen had no productive purpose in the war economy, and starving prisoners required no additional resources. In the logic of the collapsing regime, there was no incentive to intervene. Hunger became a silent executioner, working continuously without orders or bullets. Overcrowding intensified the disaster. Barracks meant for a few hundred people now held thousands. Prisoners slept packed together on wooden bunks or directly on the floor, unable to move without disturbing others. As transports continued to arrive, even these spaces vanished. Many were forced to live outdoors, exposed to winter cold, rain, and mud. Clothing was inadequate or non-existent. Shoes fell apart. Frostbite and exposure compounded the effects of malnutrition. Sanitation disintegrated almost entirely. Latrines overflowed. Clean water became scarce. Washing was impossible. Lice spread unchecked, carrying typhus, a disease that thrives where hunger, filth, and overcrowding intersect. Once typhus took hold, it moved with terrifying speed. Fever, delirium, and collapse followed. There was no real medical care. Doctors among the prisoners had no supplies, no isolation wards, and no authority to act. Sick and healthy lay together, accelerating the spread. Dysentery joined typhus as another killer. Dehydration, diarrhea, and infection weakened bodies already near collapse. Prisoners became too weak to stand for roll call. Many died where they lay, unnoticed for hours or days. Corpses accumulated inside barracks, in courtyards, along paths. There were not enough living prisoners left with the strength to remove the dead. The crematorium could not keep pace. It had never been designed for mass death on this scale. As deaths climbed into the hundreds per day, bodies were stacked in open areas, sometimes covered with thin layers of earth, sometimes left exposed. The smell of decay hung over the camp constantly. For prisoners still alive, it became part of daily existence, a reminder that survival was temporary and fragile. The SS response was marked by indifference rather than frenzy. Guards continued routine patrols. Administrative offices still functioned on paper. Roll calls were still attempted, though increasingly meaningless as prisoners collapsed during counting. There was no large-scale massacre, no final liquidation order. Instead, the camp was allowed to rot from within. This neglect was itself a form of violence. Bergen-Belsen demonstrated how genocide could proceed even without active killing when systems were designed to exclude care. By denying food, medicine, and shelter, the SS allowed nature, hunger, cold, disease, to do what bullets and gas were no longer logistically convenient to accomplish. For prisoners, psychological collapse accompanied physical decline. Time lost structure. Days blended together. Many stopped speaking. Others clung to routines, counting steps, reciting poems, remembering names, as a way to preserve identity. Acts of kindness became both rarer and more significant. A shared crust of bread, a whispered warning about disease, a hand placed on a fevered forehead. These gestures carried enormous weight in a place where survival was measured in hours. Children suffered especially. Many arrived already orphaned, weakened by ghettos and transport. In Bergen-Belsen, they received no special protection. Their smaller bodies succumbed quickly to hunger and infection. Mothers, powerless to help, watched their children fade beside them. These deaths left deep scars on survivors, memories that would haunt them long after liberation. As winter turned towards spring in 1945, Bergen-Belsen ceased to resemble a functioning camp at all. It had become a vast field of dying bodies, still enclosed by barbed wire, still guarded, but no longer governed by any coherent purpose. The Nazi system here did not explode in violence. It simply withdrew responsibility and let death take over. Outside the camp, the war was nearing its end. Allied forces were advancing from both east and west. The SS knew liberation was approaching. Yet inside Bergen-Belsen, nothing improved. Transports continued to arrive. Food did not. Disease intensified. The camp became a place where death was no longer an event, but the dominant condition of existence. What awaited the liberators was not a battlefield or an organized prison, but something far more disturbing. A space where humanity had been allowed to collapse entirely. And when the gates finally opened, the world would see the consequences of neglect elevated to policy. Chapter 2, Segment 3. The last weeks before liberation. By the final weeks of the war, Bergen-Belsen no longer functioned as a camp in any conventional sense. What remained was a sealed landscape of collapse. Tens of thousands of people trapped inside a space where death had become constant, visible, and unavoidable. The Nazi administrative system that had once categorized prisoners and tracked rations now barely existed. Orders were confused or ignored. Guards rotated without clear purpose. Paperwork continued in fragments, but reality had already overtaken the illusion of control. Transports still arrived even as the Reich disintegrated. Trains diverted from camps closer to the front unloaded prisoners who were already dying. Many had survived ghettos, forced labor camps, and death marches only to reach Bergen-Belsen at the very end. There were no barracks left to receive them. New arrivals were left in open fields or crowded into spaces already packed beyond endurance. Some died before they could even be registered. Food deliveries had effectively stopped. Prisoners scavenged grass, peels, scraps, anything that could be swallowed. Starvation no longer unfolded over weeks. It unfolded over days. Bodies that had been weakened for months now shut down rapidly. Those who still stood did so out of habit rather than strength. Many could no longer feel hunger at all, a sign that the body had entered its final phase. Disease surged without restraint. Typhus spread through contact alone. Fevered prisoners wandered in delirium. Others lay motionless, unable to call for help. There was no isolation, no quarantine, no treatment. Even prisoner doctors, once able to improvise some care, were now powerless. They watched as patients slipped beyond reach, knowing that medicine existed somewhere beyond the barbed wire but would never arrive. The dead accumulated faster than they could be removed. Corpses lay stacked between barracks, along paths, beside fences. Some were covered with thin blankets. Many were not. Prisoners stepped over bodies on the way to roll call. The living and the dead became indistinguishable at a glance. Skeletal figures wrapped in rags, eyes hollow, skin gray. The smell of decomposition saturated everything. Clung to clothes, hair, breath. SS guards were still present, but their authority had eroded. Some withdrew emotionally, avoiding contact. Others lashed out unpredictably. Violence still occurred, but it was no longer systematic. The system itself had already done its work. Bergen-Belsen had become a place where death required no enforcement. In early April 1945, the front lines closed in. Artillery could be heard in the distance. Rumors spread. Some whispered that the war was ending, others that the camp would be destroyed to eliminate witnesses. Fear intensified, but so did a fragile sense of anticipation. For prisoners who had endured years of imprisonment, hope was both irresistible and terrifying. To hope meant risking despair. Negotiations began outside the camp. German authorities, overwhelmed by disease and fearful of typhus spreading to their own troops, agreed to hand Bergen-Belsen over without resistance. This decision was not driven by mercy, but by self-preservation. The SS began to withdraw. Some guards fled. Others remained until the last moment, unsure of what would happen when the gates opened. Inside the camp, conditions did not improve. There was no sudden relief. Prisoners continued to die hourly. Many who sensed liberation approaching did not live to see it. Their bodies joined the thousands already lying unburied, anonymous witnesses to the final failure of the Nazi system. When British forces entered Bergen-Belsen in mid-April, they encountered something for which no military training had prepared them. This was not a camp of order or control. It was a humanitarian catastrophe on a scale rarely seen. Over 60,000 prisoners remained alive, most of them starving, diseased, and barely conscious. More than 10,000 corpses lay scattered across the grounds. Liberation did not immediately mean survival. Many prisoners were too weak to process food. Refeeding had to be done cautiously to avoid killing those whose bodies could no longer digest normally. Medical teams rushed in, but even with care, thousands died in the days and weeks after liberation. Typhus continued to claim lives. The camp had to be burned and dismantled to stop the spread of disease. Bergen-Belsen, in its final phase, revealed a truth that would shape post-war understanding of the Holocaust. Genocide did not always require direct killing. It could be accomplished through abandonment, through the withdrawal of care, through the systematic denial of the conditions necessary for life. Bergen-Belsen was not an extermination camp by design, but by the end, it functioned as one in effect. For survivors, memory would remain heavy. Liberation brought relief, but also grief, shock, and the unbearable knowledge of how many had been lost just short of freedom. For the world, Bergen-Belsen became one of the first camps whose images were seen widely. Piles of bodies, emaciated survivors, silence broken by disbelief. What unfolded there in the final weeks was not chaos alone. It was the final outcome of a system that had chosen neglect as policy. And its consequences would echo far beyond the barbed wire, long after the camp itself ceased to exist. Chapter 3, Segment 1. After liberation. Shock, survival, and the world awakes. Liberation did not end Bergen-Belsen. In many ways, it only began its second life, not as a functioning camp, but as a symbol, a crime scene, and a wound that would not close. When British forces took control, they did not find victory or relief waiting inside the wire. They found a disaster still unfolding in real time. Thousands were alive, but barely. Thousands more were already dead, yet still present, lying where they had fallen. The camp existed in a suspended state between life and death, and every decision made in those first days would determine who survived and who did not. The immediate task was triage on a scale never before attempted. British medical officers quickly realized that traditional emergency care would not work. Prisoners were not simply hungry. Their bodies had been starved beyond normal biological limits. Feeding them too much, too quickly could and did kill them. Organs had shut down. Digestive systems had atrophied. Even kindness, if applied without understanding, could be fatal. Special starvation diets had to be improvised under extreme pressure with limited supplies and with thousands of patients deteriorating by the hour. Disease remained the greatest enemy. Typhus continued to spread, carried by lice embedded in clothing, blankets, and hair. Entire barracks had to be isolated. British soldiers, doctors, and nurses worked knowing that infection was a constant risk. Many still entered without hesitation. They shaved prisoners, burned contaminated clothing, disinfected bodies, and attempted to impose order on a place that had known only collapse for months. Even so, death continued. Liberation stopped the system, but it could not reverse its damage overnight. To halt the epidemic, a radical decision was made. The camp itself would be destroyed. Barracks were burned. Structures were torn down. The ground was cleared. This was not an attempt to erase evidence, but to save lives. Bergen-Belsen had become too contaminated to preserve in its original form. Its destruction was necessary and deeply symbolic. A place built through neglect and cruelty would not be allowed to continue existing as a threat to the living. Meanwhile, the documentation began. British forces filmed, photographed, and recorded everything. They forced captured SS personnel to walk through the camp, to carry bodies, to confront the consequences of their actions. These images would soon be shown across Europe and beyond. For many civilians, Bergen-Belsen became the first undeniable proof of what Nazi camps truly were. Not rumors, not exaggerations, but reality. Survivors who were strong enough began to speak. Some searched desperately for relatives, calling names that would never be answered. Others remained silent, too exhausted to process what had happened. Survival itself brought guilt. Why them and not the thousands lying outside? Liberation did not restore normal life. It marked the beginning of a long, uncertain struggle to reclaim identity, health, and meaning. Displaced persons camps emerged in the aftermath. Bergen-Belsen survivors were transferred to new facilities where food, shelter, and medical care could be provided more safely. Yet even there, the trauma followed. Many had no homes to return to. Entire families had vanished. Countries had changed borders. Anti-Semitism had not disappeared with the fall of the Reich. For some, liberation was not a return, it was a beginning without a map. The camp also became a courtroom. Investigations moved quickly. British authorities gathered evidence, testimonies, and records. Former guards, administrators, and camp officials were arrested. Trials would soon follow, including the first Bergen-Belsen trial later in 1945. Unlike later proceedings, these trials took place almost immediately, while memories were raw and evidence was fresh. Survivors testified face to face against those who had once held power over their lives. Bergen-Belsen, in this phase, transformed from a place of abandonment into a place of confrontation. The world could no longer look away. Newspapers printed photographs. Newsreels showed skeletal figures and mass graves. The phrase concentration camp gained its full meaning in the public consciousness. What had been abstract horror became visual, undeniable, and permanent. Yet even as the world reacted, many truths remained difficult to absorb. Bergen-Belsen had no gas chambers, no industrial killing facilities, and still tens of thousands had died. This forced a reckoning. Genocide did not require elaborate machinery, could be achieved through indifference, overcrowding, starvation, and the systematic withdrawal of care. Bergen-Belsen exposed the deadly power of neglect. For history, this mattered deeply. It expanded the understanding of how mass death could occur. It showed that the Holocaust was not only about extermination camps, but about a broader system that allowed camps like Bergen-Belsen to become death zones through deliberate abandonment. This realization would shape post-war scholarship, memory, and education. In the months that followed, Bergen-Belsen faded physically but grew symbolically. Its name entered court transcripts, textbooks, survivor memoirs, and memorial speeches. It stood as proof not only of Nazi crimes, but of what happens when bureaucracy replaces humanity and suffering is allowed to persist unchecked. The camp no longer existed as it once had. But what happened there could not be dismantled. It had already imprinted itself onto history and into the conscience of a world that would spend decades trying to understand how it had been allowed to happen at all. Chapter 3, Segment 2. The Trials, the Witnesses, and the Struggle for Truth. As the physical ruins of Bergen-Belsen were cleared, another, quieter battle began. One fought with testimony instead of weapons, and memory instead of force. Justice, unlike liberation, did not arrive instantly. It had to be constructed piece by piece, in a world still reeling from what it had just seen. Bergen-Belsen became one of the first places where the crimes of the camp system were formally confronted, not in theory, but in courtrooms filled with survivors, documents, and living evidence. The British military authorities moved quickly. Within weeks of liberation, they arrested dozens of former SS guards, camp administrators, and medical personnel connected to Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. Many had attempted to blend into the chaos of retreat, discarding uniforms and false papers, hoping to disappear into the civilian population. But the scale of the crime made anonymity impossible. Survivors recognized faces. Records were recovered. Witnesses were willing and determined to speak. The Bergen-Belsen trial began in September 1945, held in the city of Lüneburg. It was one of the earliest war crimes trials conducted by the Allied powers, predating the conclusion of the Nuremberg proceedings. Unlike later trials that dealt with policy and command structures, this trial focused directly on individual responsibility inside the camps. Guards were not prosecuted for ideology alone, but for what they did and what they allowed to happen. Survivor testimony formed the heart of the case. Men and women who had barely survived typhus, starvation, and brutality now stood in courtrooms to recount what they had seen and endured. Many were still physically weak. Some fainted while speaking. Others broke down mid-sentence. But they spoke anyway. They described beatings, selections, deliberate withholding of food, the indifference of guards to mass death, and the conditions that turned Bergen-Belsen into a killing ground without gas chambers. For many survivors, testifying was both necessary and devastating. They were asked to relive moments they had tried desperately to suppress. Yet they understood that silence would allow denial to take root. This was their chance to ensure that what happened inside the wire could not be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. Their words became part of the historical record, sworn, transcribed, and preserved. The defendants, meanwhile, often claimed ignorance. They insisted they were following orders. They argued that conditions were the result of wartime shortages. Some blamed superiors who were already dead or missing. Others attempted to portray themselves as powerless functionaries inside a collapsing system. The court rejected many of these defenses. It ruled that participation, complicity, and indifference were themselves crimes when they contributed to mass suffering and death. Several defendants were convicted and sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms. Some were acquitted due to lack of evidence, a reality that frustrated many survivors but underscored a difficult truth. Justice required proof, not only moral certainty. The trials were imperfect. They could not punish everyone. They could not restore the dead. But they established an essential precedent that crimes committed inside camps like Bergen-Belsen were not accidents of war, but prosecutable acts against humanity. Beyond the courtroom, the struggle for truth continued in public memory. Photographs from Bergen-Belsen were published widely. Newsreels were shown in cinemas across Europe and North America. Audiences watched scenes of mass graves, skeletal survivors, and bulldozers pushing bodies into pits. For many civilians, this was their first confrontation with the full reality of the camps. Shock turned into disbelief, then into reckoning. Yet even as evidence spread, denial and minimization began to appear. Some questioned the numbers. Others argued that Bergen-Belsen was an exception, not representative of the system. Survivors quickly realized that memory itself was fragile. Without continued testimony, documentation, and education, the truth could be eroded. This realization drove many to write memoirs, give interviews, and speak publicly, even when doing so reopened wounds. Bergen-Belsen also influenced how the Holocaust was understood legally and historically. Because it lacked gas chambers, it challenged simplistic definitions of genocide. Prosecutors and historians had to articulate how deliberate neglect, starvation, overcrowding, and denial of medical care constituted extermination. Bergen-Belsen proved that mass death could be achieved without explicit killing orders, simply by creating conditions in which death became inevitable. This understanding shaped later war crimes law. Concepts such as crimes against humanity, responsibility for inhumane conditions, and accountability for systemic abuse were strengthened by cases like Bergen-Belsen. The camp became a reference point in legal arguments and moral philosophy alike, a place that forced the world to confront how evil could be bureaucratic, passive, and administrative. For survivors, however, the trials were only one step. Justice in court did not guarantee justice in life. Many returned to countries that no longer felt like home. Some encountered renewed anti-Semitism. Others struggled with illness, trauma, and the absence of family. Bergen-Belsen had taken more than years, it had taken futures. No verdict could restore what was lost. Still, the act of bearing witness mattered. Each testimony pushed back against forgetting. Each document preserved ensured that Bergen-Belsen would not vanish as completely as its physical structures had. The camp existed now in words, images, and memory, fragile but powerful. In this way, Bergen-Belsen entered its final transformation. From a place of abandonment, it became a site of warning. From chaos, it became evidence. From silence, it became a voice, carried by those who survived, and by those who chose to listen. Chapter 3, Segment 3. Memory, Denial, and the Meaning of Bergen-Belsen. As the trials concluded and the headlines faded, Bergen-Belsen entered its most uncertain phase, not as a place but as a memory. The camp no longer killed, but it did not rest. What followed was a long, uneven struggle over how Bergen-Belsen would be remembered, understood, and taught in a world eager to move forward and forget. Liberation and justice had exposed the crime, but remembrance required something far more fragile: sustained attention. In the immediate post-war years, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were rebuilt, borders were redrawn, and new political realities emerged. In this environment, Bergen-Belsen risked becoming a symbol too heavy to carry. For many Germans, it represented shame and defeat. For much of the international community, it was one horror among many in a war filled with them. And for survivors, it was a wound that never closed, one that followed them into every new beginning. The physical site of Bergen-Belsen reflected this uncertainty. Unlike camps preserved immediately as memorials, the grounds were initially left largely untouched. The British had burned the barracks to stop disease. What remained was an open, grassy expanse marked only by mass graves and the traces of foundations beneath the soil. Visitors could walk across the land without realizing what lay below their feet. Silence settled where screams once filled the air. This silence was dangerous. Without visible structures, Bergen-Belsen became easier to deny, easier to minimize, easier to misrepresent. In the years that followed, early Holocaust deniers seized upon this absence. They argued that because there were no gas chambers, Bergen-Belsen could not be considered an extermination site. They claimed deaths were caused only by wartime shortages or disease, stripping responsibility from the system that created those conditions. Historians and survivors pushed back. They documented how starvation was intentional, how overcrowding was engineered, how medical neglect was enforced. Bergen-Belsen, they argued, was not a failure of the system, it was a function of it. Death was not incidental. It was the outcome of deliberate policy. The camp demonstrated that genocide did not require a single method. It could be achieved through neglect just as efficiently as through machinery. As scholarship grew, Bergen-Belsen took on new significance. It became central to understanding the Holocaust as a system rather than a collection of isolated crimes. It showed how camps could evolve over time, from detention to exploitation to mass death, without ever changing their official designation. Bergen-Belsen exposed the flexibility of Nazi terror, its ability to adapt to circumstance while maintaining its core objective, the destruction of human life. Survivors continued to play a critical role in this fight for truth. Many returned to Bergen-Belsen years later, standing before empty fields where their families had died. Some left stones. Others spoke aloud names that had no graves. Their presence transformed the land. Memory filled the space where buildings once stood. Through testimony, the camp was rebuilt, not physically but morally. Gradually, formal remembrance followed. Memorial markers were erected. Documentation centers were established. Educational programs began to take shape. Bergen-Belsen was no longer just a place of death. It became a place of learning. Visitors were confronted not with reconstructed barracks, but with absence itself, a deliberate choice meant to emphasize loss rather than spectacle. This approach carried a powerful message. Bergen-Belsen did not ask visitors to look at buildings. It asked them to imagine lives, to stand on ground where tens of thousands died without shelter, without medicine, without dignity, and to understand that this emptiness was the result of human decisions, not natural disaster. Yet remembrance remained contested. Even decades later, debates emerged over numbers, responsibility, and language. How many died? Who was to blame? How should the story be told? Each question revealed how fragile historical truth could be when confronted by ideology, politics, or fatigue. Bergen-Belsen became a reminder that memory itself requires defense. For younger generations, Bergen-Belsen posed a different challenge. As eyewitnesses aged and passed away, the responsibility of remembrance shifted. The camp story had to be carried by documents, educators, and descendants who did not experience it firsthand. This transition raised urgent questions. How do you teach atrocity without turning it into abstraction? How do you preserve urgency without survivors' voices in the room? The answer, many argued, lay in understanding systems. Bergen-Belsen's legacy was not only about what happened there, but about how it happened. About bureaucracy that replaced conscience. About indifference that became lethal. About a society that allowed human beings to be reduced to numbers, then forgotten. In this sense, Bergen-Belsen speaks not only to the past, but to the present. It warns that genocide does not always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through neglect, dehumanization, and the normalization of suffering. It reminds us that waiting for gas chambers to recognize evil is waiting too long. Today, Bergen-Belsen stands as both a grave and a lesson. The grass grows, birds sing, visitors walk slowly, often in silence. There are no fences now, no guards, no sirens. But beneath the calm lies a truth that cannot be buried. This was a place where humanity collapsed, not all at once, but gradually, until death became ordinary. Remembering Bergen-Belsen is not about guilt alone. It is about responsibility. The responsibility to recognize systems that strip people of dignity. The responsibility to challenge indifference. And the responsibility to speak, even when silence feels easier. Because Bergen-Belsen teaches a final, enduring truth. Forgetting is not neutral. It is the final stage of violence. Chapter 4, Segment 1. From Camp to Catastrophe. How Bergen-Belsen became a place of mass death. Bergen-Belsen was not built to be a death camp. That fact has often been used to misunderstand it, and sometimes to excuse it. In its early years, the camp existed on paper as something temporary, administrative, almost benign by Nazi standards. But history does not judge camps by what they were called. It judges them by what they became. And Bergen-Belsen became a place where death arrived not in a single moment, but in waves, slow, relentless, and overwhelming. To understand how Bergen-Belsen turned into a mass grave, we must follow the system as it collapsed inward on itself. By late 1943 and early 1944, the Nazi concentration camp network was under immense strain. The war was turning against Germany. Allied bombing campaigns disrupted transportation and industry. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was advancing, forcing the SS to evacuate camps deep inside occupied territories. Prisoners were no longer confined to where they had been captured. They were moved, again and again, across a shrinking Reich. Bergen-Belsen became one of the destinations for these evacuations. Train after train arrived carrying prisoners from Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, Mittelbau-Dora, and dozens of subcamps. These transports were not organized for survival. They were organized for speed. Prisoners were crammed into cattle cars with no food, little air, and no sanitation. Many died before the trains reached the camp. Those who survived arrived already broken, emaciated, diseased, and barely able to stand. The camp was not prepared for this influx. It had never been designed to hold such numbers. Barracks built for a few hundred now contained thousands. Straw bedding disappeared. Prisoners slept on bare floors, stacked against one another for warmth. The air inside the barracks became thick with the smell of sweat, waste, and decay. Windows were often sealed. Ventilation was non-existent. Disease spread unchecked. Food rations collapsed under the pressure. What little structure had existed broke apart. Bread was reduced to crumbs. Soup became thin water with scraps floating on the surface. Hunger was constant, not sharp and sudden, but dull and consuming, eroding the body day by day. Prisoners ate grass, bark, anything they could find. Many simply lay down and stopped moving, conserving what little energy remained. Medical care was effectively non-existent. The camp infirmary was overwhelmed within weeks. There were no medicines, no disinfectants, no real treatment. Doctors among the prisoners tried to help using scraps of cloth and boiled water, but typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia spread faster than any human effort could contain. Lice infested clothing and skin. Fever became a death sentence. The SS did not intervene to stop this collapse. They did not improve conditions. They did not reduce transports. They did not evacuate the sick to hospitals. Instead, they sealed the camp off and let the system run its course. Guards avoided contact. Administrative records grew thinner. Order gave way to abandonment. By early 1945, Bergen-Belsen was no longer functioning as a camp in any meaningful sense. It had become a dumping ground, a place where the SS sent prisoners they no longer wished to manage. People arrived not to be exploited for labor, but to be left behind. Death was no longer organized efficiently. It was allowed to spread organically. Bodies began to accumulate faster than they could be buried. Prisoners were forced to carry corpses outside the barracks, stacking them in piles near mass graves. In some areas, bodies lay for days where they fell. There were no coffins, no markers, no rituals. Death became visible everywhere, in the paths between barracks, beside latrines, near water pumps. Psychological collapse followed physical collapse. Prisoners who had survived years of camps lost the will to speak. Some stared blankly for hours. Others whispered names of family members already dead. Time lost meaning. Days blurred together. Survival became a matter of chance rather than effort. The SS command still issued orders, but those orders were increasingly detached from reality. Paperwork continued. Numbers were recorded. But the camp itself was disintegrating. Guards were fewer. Discipline was inconsistent. Violence still occurred, but neglect killed far more effectively. Bergen-Belsen had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a place of detention. It was no longer even a place of control. It had become a place of abandonment, where tens of thousands were left to die not because of chaos alone, but because the system allowed it. This transformation was not accidental. It was the final expression of a system that had always viewed prisoners as disposable. When labor was no longer useful, when transport was no longer efficient, when defeat loomed, the system did not reverse itself. It simply stopped caring who lived and who died. By the spring of 1945, Bergen-Belsen was killing more people per day than many extermination camps had at their peak. Not through gas, but through hunger, disease, and indifference. Death without spectacle. Death without urgency. Death as routine. And the world outside did not yet know. The catastrophe unfolding behind the wire remained largely invisible, until the gates were opened, and the silence finally broke. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Disease, Starvation, and Abandonment. Life inside Bergen-Belsen at its worst. Inside Bergen-Belsen, death did not arrive with commands or machinery. It arrived quietly, spreading from body to body, bed to bed, barack to barack. By the winter of 1944 into early 1945, the camp existed in a state of controlled neglect, where the absence of care became as lethal as any deliberate act of violence. This was the phase in which Bergen-Belsen revealed its most devastating reality, not as a place of execution, but as a place where the human body was allowed to fail completely. The collapse of hygiene was total. Latrines overflowed almost immediately under the crushing population. Water supplies were limited, frozen in winter, contaminated in warmer months. Prisoners went weeks without washing. Clothing, already threadbare, became stiff with filth. Lice multiplied uncontrollably, crawling through seams, hair, and wounds. These lice carried typhus, the disease that would become Bergen-Belsen's silent executioner. Typhus spread rapidly through overcrowded barracks where thousands slept packed together, often touching, sharing the same straw or bare floor. Fever swept through the camp in waves. Prisoners burned with heat one moment, shook violently the next. Delirium followed. Many wandered aimlessly, unable to recognize where they were. Others collapsed where they stood, too weak to reach shelter. There was nowhere to isolate the sick. No quarantine. Disease was not contained, it was amplified. Starvation accelerated everything. The body, already weakened by months or years of deprivation, had no reserves left. Muscles wasted away. Skin clung to bone. Legs swelled with edema, making walking impossible. Wounds refused to heal. Even minor infections became fatal. Hunger was constant, unrelenting, and humiliating. Prisoners spent hours thinking about food, remembering meals from childhood, imagining tastes they would never feel again. Rations, when they arrived, were meaningless. A piece of bread meant to sustain a person for a day was shared between several. Soup was little more than warm water. Sometimes it did not come at all. There was no consistency, no predictability. Survival depended not on strength but on chance, on whether one collapsed today or tomorrow. The camp infirmary, if it could still be called that, was a place of despair. Beds were crowded with bodies already beyond help. There were no medicines, no bandages, no disinfectants. Doctors among the prisoners could do nothing but observe and comfort. They watched patients slip into unconsciousness and die, one after another, powerless to intervene. Many medical prisoners later testified that this helplessness was one of the most crushing experiences of their lives. Death became ordinary. Prisoners stopped reacting to it. When someone died beside them during the night, the body remained until morning, sometimes longer. Corpses were dragged outside and stacked in open areas, forming piles that grew higher each day. The smell of decomposition hung constantly in the air, mixing with smoke from cremation pits that could not keep up with the numbers. Burial details were formed from prisoners barely able to stand. They carried bodies that weighed almost nothing, the flesh already consumed by hunger and disease. Graves were shallow. Sometimes bodies were simply covered with earth hastily pushed over them. Other times, there was no burial at all, only accumulation. The SS guards largely withdrew from daily interaction. Many were afraid of disease themselves. Orders were shouted from a distance. Physical violence still occurred, but it was no longer the primary instrument of death. The system no longer needed to beat or shoot. It had created conditions that killed automatically. Psychological collapse spread alongside physical decay. Prisoners lost the ability to hope. Time dissolved. Days passed without distinction. Some prisoners no longer spoke. Others whispered prayers, songs, or names of loved ones. Children cried weakly until even that stopped. The instinct to survive, so strong for so long, began to fade. Yet even here, small acts of humanity persisted. Prisoners shared crumbs of bread. They supported one another when walking became impossible. Some attempted to clean wounds with scraps of cloth. These gestures did not stop death, but they preserved something essential: the refusal to become entirely erased. By March 1945, Bergen-Belsen was killing thousands each week. The camp leadership did not attempt to evacuate everyone. There was no plan to save lives. The SS knew the Allies were approaching. They knew what would be found. And still, transports continued to arrive. Still, food supplies were not increased. Still, disease was ignored. This was not chaos alone. It was abandonment as policy. The camp had reached a state where death no longer required orders. It simply happened everywhere all the time. Bergen-Belsen became a place where the boundary between living and dying was so thin that prisoners crossed it without anyone noticing. And as this catastrophe unfolded, just beyond the barbed wire, the war moved closer to its end, unaware or unwilling to see what was happening inside. Liberation was approaching, but for tens of thousands it would come too late. Chapter 4, Segment 3. The final weeks before liberation. Collapse without end. By the final weeks of March and early April 1945, Bergen-Belsen no longer functioned as a camp in any conventional sense. It had become a vast, uncontained field of human collapse. A place where the systems that once enforced control had disintegrated, but death continued uninterrupted. Authority still existed in name, but order was gone. What remained was inertia. A camp left to rot with tens of thousands of people trapped inside it, too weak to flee, too sick to survive, and too forgotten to be helped. The population of Bergen-Belsen had swollen to catastrophic levels. Transports continued to arrive even as Germany was losing the war on all fronts. Prisoners were dumped into the camp with no preparation, no food allocations, and no shelter space. New arrivals stepped into a world already beyond endurance. Many died within days, some within hours, unable to withstand conditions that long-term prisoners had barely survived. Barracks overflowed completely. Floors disappeared beneath layers of bodies, straw, filth, and waste. Many prisoners no longer attempted to reach sleeping areas. They collapsed wherever their strength failed, between buildings, near latrines, beside roads. Movement itself became dangerous. Walking meant stepping over the dead, slipping in mud mixed with excrement, or falling into unconsciousness from weakness. The SS presence grew increasingly erratic. Some guards abandoned their posts. Others remained but avoided direct contact, terrified of disease. Commands were issued sporadically and often ignored, not out of resistance, but because prisoners were physically incapable of responding. Roll calls became meaningless rituals performed over masses of people who could not stand upright. Bodies of the dead were counted alongside the living. Food distribution, already inadequate, effectively ceased. Whatever supplies existed were sporadic and symbolic. Prisoners survived on nothing but hunger and memory. The body began consuming itself completely, muscle, then fat, then organs. Death from starvation was slow, painful, and unavoidable. Disease reached its peak. Typhus raged unchecked, joined by dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia. Fever burned through the camp day and night. The sounds of coughing, moaning, and delirious speech never stopped. Many prisoners lost their sight temporarily. Others slipped into comas from which they never returned. There was no separation between the sick and the dying. Everyone was both. The camp's dead were no longer removed in any systematic way. Burial details collapsed as those assigned to them fell ill or died. Corpses accumulated faster than they could be moved. Entire sections of the camp became open graveyards. Bodies stacked near barracks, along fences, beside roads. The smell of decay was overwhelming, visible even from a distance. It settled over the camp like a permanent fog. Psychological disintegration followed physical ruin. Prisoners no longer reacted to death. They stepped around bodies without looking. Many stopped speaking altogether. Names, dates, memories all faded. Survival narrowed to the next minute, then the next breath. Hope became abstract, almost meaningless. Liberation was rumored, whispered, doubted. Many had heard such rumors before and watched them die. Children were among the most vulnerable. Orphans wandered aimlessly, too weak to cry, clinging to adults who could not protect them. Some sat beside the bodies of parents who had died days earlier, unable to leave. Others disappeared quietly into the mass of death without anyone noticing. The SS command knew the British Army was approaching. Orders came to evacuate parts of the camp, but chaos and disease made large-scale movement impossible. Negotiations occurred behind the scenes, attempting to transfer control of the camp to avoid the spread of typhus into German civilian areas. Bergen-Belsen had become a liability, not because of its crimes, but because of its consequences. In the final days, something unprecedented occurred. The Nazis did not destroy the camp. They did not evacuate everyone. They did not hide the evidence. Bergen-Belsen was simply left behind, abandoned with its dead, its dying, and its survivors suspended between life and death. For prisoners, the days blurred together. Some sensed the end was near. Others were too far gone to understand anything beyond pain. People continued to die at an enormous rate, thousands each week, even as Allied forces closed in. When liberation finally came, it did not arrive as a moment of triumph. It arrived as shock. But before that moment, before the gates opened, before the cameras recorded what lay inside. Bergen-Belsen existed in this final state. A place where killing no longer required intention, where abandonment itself became the last weapon of the Nazi system. This was the camp at the edge of the war. And for many, it was the edge of existence itself. Chapter 5, Segment 1. Liberation without relief. When freedom arrived too late. On the morning of April 15, 1945, British forces of the 11th Armored Division approached Bergen-Belsen expecting to secure a military installation and accept the surrender of a camp holding prisoners of war. What they encountered instead was something no training, briefing, or battlefield experience had prepared them for. Before the gates were even opened, the smell reached them first. A thick, sickening stench of decay that hung over the landscape and seeped into uniforms, vehicles, and lungs. It was the smell of thousands of unburied dead. As British soldiers entered the camp, they stepped into a world that had already collapsed beyond recognition. Bergen-Belsen was no longer a functioning camp. It was a mass grave that still breathed. More than 60,000 prisoners remained alive inside the wire, most of them skeletal, feverish, and barely conscious. Surrounding them were an estimated 13,000 corpses lying where they had fallen, in barracks, along paths, beside latrines, and stacked in open fields. Some bodies had been dead for weeks. Others were still warm. The guards did not resist. Many SS personnel had already fled. Those who remained were disarmed and detained immediately. But even this act of liberation felt hollow. There was no victory here, only disbelief. Hardened soldiers who had survived years of combat stood frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. Some vomited. Others broke down completely. Silence dominated the camp, broken only by coughing, moaning, and the faint voices of survivors who no longer understood what freedom meant. The prisoners did not cheer. Many were too weak to move. Some stared blankly at the soldiers, unable to comprehend that the uniforms before them were not another illusion. Others attempted to stand and collapsed instantly. A number of prisoners died at the very moment of liberation, their bodies simply giving out after enduring one burden too many. British medics entered the camp almost immediately, but the scale of the disaster overwhelmed every available resource. Disease was rampant. Typhus alone threatened to spread beyond the camp into the surrounding civilian population and the occupying troops themselves. The camp was placed under quarantine within hours. Liberation had arrived, but danger had not ended. The medical teams faced an impossible situation. Thousands were starving, but feeding them too quickly could kill them. Refeeding syndrome, unknown to most doctors at the time, caused organs to fail when nourishment was reintroduced improperly. Survivors who begged for food sometimes died after eating. Others refused to eat at all, their bodies no longer able to recognize hunger. Every decision carried the risk of death. Barracks were so overcrowded and contaminated that they could not be used safely. Entire sections of the camp were burned to stop the spread of disease, even as prisoners still lay inside. Survivors were moved into nearby German military barracks, often carried on stretchers or blankets because they could no longer walk. Many died during these transfers, their bodies too damaged to survive even rescue. The dead had to be dealt with immediately. British troops ordered German civilians from nearby towns to assist in burying the corpses. A deliberate act meant to force the local population to confront what had existed in their midst. Bulldozers were brought in. Mass graves were dug. Bodies were pushed, lifted, and stacked in silence. Some soldiers wept openly while performing this work. Documentation began almost at once. Photographers and film crews were summoned to record everything before it could be altered or denied. The images captured at Bergen-Belsen would later be shown around the world, becoming some of the most iconic and horrifying visual evidence of the Holocaust. These were not staged scenes. They were not reconstructions. They were reality preserved before it could disappear. For survivors, liberation was not the end of suffering. It was merely the beginning of a new struggle. Many remained hospitalized for months. Some never recovered physically. Others survived only to discover that their families were gone, their homes destroyed, their identities erased. Freedom arrived, but the world they had known no longer existed. Children wandered the camp without parents. Many did not know their own names or ages. Relief workers attempted to care for them, but trauma had stripped away language, trust, and memory. Survival had narrowed their lives so completely that imagining a future felt impossible. The British administration worked tirelessly to restore order, establish medical care, and stabilize the situation, but the damage inflicted by Bergen-Belsen could not be undone. Thousands continued to die after liberation, victims not of SS violence, but of the long-term effects of starvation, disease, and exhaustion deliberately imposed over months and years. Bergen-Belsen exposed a horrifying truth. Liberation does not erase atrocity. It only reveals it. The camp had not been discovered in time. The killing had not been stopped early enough. What the British Army liberated was not a prison, but the aftermath of a system that had already done its work. And as the gates stood open for the first time, one reality became painfully clear. For many, freedom had come too late to matter at all. Chapter 5, Segment 2. After the gates. Survival, justice, and the struggle to remember. In the days and weeks following liberation, Bergen-Belsen ceased to exist as a concentration camp, but it did not cease to exist as a wound. The barbed wire remained. The watchtowers still cast their shadows. The ground itself seemed poisoned by what had happened there. For the survivors, life did not resume. It had to be rebuilt from a point beyond collapse, with bodies weakened, families erased, and identities fractured by years of terror. British authorities immediately transformed the surrounding area into a vast emergency zone. Hospitals were improvised almost overnight. German military barracks, schools, and any usable structure within reach were converted into treatment centers. Doctors and nurses from across Britain and the Allied forces were rushed in, many encountering mass starvation on this scale for the first time in their careers. There was no handbook for this. Every hour demanded decisions that could save one life while costing another. Survivors were classified not by nationality, but by physical condition. Those who could still swallow were fed carefully measured rations. Those who could not were given liquids in spoonfuls. Even so, death continued relentlessly. The human body, starved and infected for so long, often could not recover. Liberation did not end the dying. It only changed its cause. Typhus remained the greatest immediate threat. Entire sections of the former camp were sealed off, disinfected, and eventually burned. Barracks were destroyed deliberately, their contents, including bedding, clothing, and personal belongings, incinerated to prevent further spread. Smoke once again rose over Bergen-Belsen, not from crematoria, but from the attempt to stop death from claiming more lives. The SS personnel captured at the camp were detained nearby under guard. British officers documented everything: names, ranks, responsibilities. For the first time, perpetrators were forced to stand among the evidence of their actions. They were ordered to carry corpses, dig graves, and witness the results of the system they had enforced. Some broke down. Others showed no emotion at all. The British Army understood that Bergen-Belsen was not only a humanitarian catastrophe, but a legal one. Evidence had to be preserved. Testimonies had to be recorded. Survivors who could speak were interviewed, often while still bedridden. Their words were halting, fragmented, and painfully precise. They described hunger as a constant presence. disease as an inevitability, death as background noise. Many had lost the ability to cry. In September 1945, the Belsen trial began in Lüneburg, marking one of the earliest war crimes trials held by the Allies. 45 former camp staff and collaborators were charged, including Commandant Joseph Kramer. Survivors testified in court, facing the men and women who had overseen their suffering. For many, this was the first time they spoke publicly about what had happened. Their voices shook, but they did not falter. The trials resulted in multiple death sentences and long prison terms. Kramer and several others were executed. Yet even as justice was served, it felt incomplete. Bergen-Belsen was not the result of a handful of sadistic individuals. It was the outcome of a system, one that rewarded obedience, normalized neglect, and transformed indifference into mass death. Courts could punish individuals, but they could not prosecute an entire ideology. For survivors, the end of the trials did not bring closure. Most had nowhere to go. Their homes were destroyed or occupied. Their communities no longer existed. Many remained in displaced persons camps for years, living in limbo, neither prisoners nor free citizens. Bergen-Belsen itself became one of the largest DP camps in post-war Europe, ironically transforming from a place of death into a temporary refuge for those who had nowhere else. Children posed the greatest challenge. Thousands were orphaned. Many did not know their real names, their birthplaces, or even their native languages. Aid workers attempted to reunite families, but most searches ended in silence. For these children, survival meant growing up without roots, carrying trauma they could not yet articulate. The physical camp was eventually dismantled. Barracks were removed. Watchtowers came down. Grass was allowed to reclaim the land. But memory did not fade so easily. Survivors returned years later, walking the same paths where they had once collapsed from hunger. The absence of buildings made the horror harder to visualize and easier to deny. That denial began almost immediately. As the years passed, voices emerged claiming exaggeration, fabrication, or outright falsehood. Bergen-Belsen became one of the most documented camps precisely because it had been liberated in front of cameras. The images, the testimonies, the trials all stood as a response to denial before it could take root. Memorials were erected. Mass graves were marked. Names were recovered where possible. But remembrance required effort, education, and confrontation. Bergen-Belsen was not a death factory like Auschwitz. It had no gas chambers designed for industrial murder. And yet, tens of thousands died there, killed by a system that weaponized neglect, starvation, and disease. This distinction mattered deeply. It revealed that genocide does not require machinery alone. It can be accomplished through abandonment, through bureaucracy, through the decision to let people die slowly because saving them was deemed unnecessary. For the survivors, the legacy of Bergen-Belsen lived on in bodies that never fully healed and memories that never rested. Many spent their lives speaking, writing, and testifying, not because they wanted to relive the past, but because silence would allow it to happen again. Bergen-Belsen became a warning written not in gas chambers, but in graves without numbers, a place that proved that mass death does not always arrive with explosions or executions. Sometimes it arrives quietly, one weakened body at a time, while the world looks away. And long after the camp vanished from the landscape, its lesson remained painfully clear. The absence of murder does not mean the absence of crime. Chapter 5, Segment 3. Bergen-Belsen after Belsen. Memory, denial, and the long shadow. When the immediate crisis passed and the last mass graves were sealed, Bergen-Belsen entered a new and quieter phase of existence, one that would last far longer than the camp itself ever had. The suffering no longer unfolded in public view, but it did not end. It transformed into memory, into trauma carried by survivors, and into a global struggle over how or whether this place would be remembered. In the months following liberation, the former campgrounds were deliberately erased. British authorities ordered the remaining barracks demolished, both to eliminate lingering disease and to prevent the site from becoming unmanageable. Grass was planted. Trees were allowed to grow. The land was made deceptively peaceful. Where thousands had died in filth and chaos, there was suddenly silence. For many survivors, this erasure felt like a second loss, as though the world were too eager to move on. Yet the memory of Bergen-Belsen could not be buried as easily as its structures. The photographs taken during liberation had already circulated across newspapers, newsreels, and courtrooms. They became some of the most recognizable images of the Holocaust. Piles of emaciated corpses, skeletal survivors staring through barbed wire, bulldozers pushing bodies into mass graves. These images defined Bergen-Belsen in the global imagination, but they also reduced its complexity to a single frozen moment. For survivors, this simplification was painful. Bergen-Belsen was not just a place of liberation photographs. It was years of fear, hunger, and slow death. It was overcrowded huts, endless roll calls, whispered rumors, and the constant calculation of how to survive one more night. The world saw the ending, but few understood the process that led there. As time passed, denial and distortion began to surface. Some claimed that Bergen-Belsen was merely a refugee camp, overwhelmed by circumstances at the end of the war. Others argued that the deaths were unavoidable consequences of wartime shortages. These narratives ignored the deliberate decisions that created the catastrophe. The mass transfers of prisoners without preparation, the refusal to provide adequate food or medical care, the SS systematic neglect even when collapse was obvious. Survivors responded by speaking. They wrote memoirs. They gave testimony in schools, courtrooms, and public forums. Many returned to Bergen-Belsen again and again, standing before mass graves and telling their stories aloud, not for themselves, but for those who could no longer speak. Memory became an act of resistance. The site gradually transformed into a memorial landscape. Rather than reconstructing barracks, authorities chose to mark mass graves with stones, inscriptions, and symbolic monuments. This decision was controversial. Some argued that the absence of buildings made the scale of the crime harder to grasp. Others believed that recreating structures risked turning suffering into spectacle. In the end, Bergen-Belsen remained largely empty, a field of quiet markers and names, demanding imagination rather than offering explanation. Education became central to the camp's legacy. Bergen-Belsen was integrated into Holocaust curricula across Europe and beyond. Its story was used to demonstrate that genocide does not always appear as immediate, mechanized murder. It can emerge through neglect, through indifference, through systems that allow people to die because saving them is inconvenient or unnecessary. This lesson resonated deeply in the post-war world. Bergen-Belsen stood as proof that mass death does not require gas chambers. It can be achieved by stripping people of food, sanitation, and dignity, and then doing nothing while they perish. This understanding broadened the definition of crimes against humanity and influenced international law, shaping conventions on genocide, human rights, and the treatment of prisoners. For many survivors, however, legal definitions offered little comfort. Trauma lingered in bodies and minds long after justice was declared. Nightmares, illness, survivors' guilt, these followed them into old age. Some never spoke of Bergen-Belsen at all, carrying their memories in silence until the end of their lives. Children who survived grew into adults shaped by absence. Many had no family history to pass on, no graves to visit for parents or siblings. Bergen-Belsen was their origin point, a place of suffering that also marked the beginning of survival. Their identities were forged in contradiction. They lived because others did not. As decades passed, Bergen-Belsen became a place visited by students, historians, and descendants. Each generation brought new questions. How could this happen? Who was responsible? Could it happen again? The answers were never simple, and that complexity became part of the camp's meaning. Bergen-Belsen did not teach the world about gas chambers. It taught the world about abandonment, about what happens when a system decides that certain lives are not worth saving, about how death can be bureaucratic, slow, and quiet, and therefore easier to ignore. Today, the land is calm. Birds move through the trees. Wind passes over grass that once covered mass graves. Without guidance, a visitor might see nothing at all. And that is precisely why memory matters. Because Bergen-Belsen's greatest danger is not that it will be remembered incorrectly, but that it will not be remembered at all. The camp no longer kills, but its lesson remains lethal if forgotten. Bergen-Belsen stands as a warning written not in buildings, but in absence, a reminder that genocide does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives with silence, neglect, and the decision to let people die. And history shows us, again and again, that silence is never neutral. Chapter 6, Segment 1. Bergen-Belsen in History. How a camp without gas chambers became a symbol of genocide. Bergen-Belsen occupies a unique and deeply unsettling place in the history of the Holocaust, not because it followed the familiar pattern of extermination camps, but because it did not. There were no purpose-built gas chambers, no industrial killing installations, no daily selections carried out on arrival. And yet, more than 50,000 people died there. Bergen-Belsen forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Genocide does not require a single method. It can be carried out through systems of neglect, overcrowding, starvation, and disease just as effectively as through direct execution. Understanding Bergen-Belsen means understanding how mass death can occur when cruelty is embedded not in machinery, but in policy, indifference, and collapse that is allowed, even engineered, to continue. From its earliest days, Bergen-Belsen was never meant to be humane. Even when it functioned as a prisoner of war camp or an exchange camp, its purpose was rooted in control, exploitation, and political calculation. Human beings were held as bargaining tools, categorized by perceived usefulness, nationality, or political value. Their lives were not protected, they were managed. This bureaucratic mindset would define the camp's evolution and ultimately seal its fate. What makes Bergen-Belsen historically significant is that it reveals how genocide can unfold without explicit extermination orders at every stage. By 1944 and early 1945, the Nazi system was collapsing under military pressure, but its priorities remained chillingly clear. Trains continued to move. Deportations continued. Prisoners were transferred in massive numbers from camps in the east, even though Bergen-Belsen lacked food, water, shelter, or medical capacity to receive them. These decisions were not accidents. They were deliberate acts made with full awareness of the consequences. In this sense, Bergen-Belsen represents the end stage of the Nazi camp system, a place where ideology, logistics, and indifference collided. The SS no longer needed to actively kill in order to cause death. They simply needed to keep transporting people into a space that could not sustain life. Starvation, typhus, exposure, and exhaustion did the rest. Death became ambient, something that happened everywhere, constantly, without ceremony or interruption. This is why Bergen-Belsen shattered post-war assumptions about what genocide looks like. Early narratives of the Holocaust focused heavily on gas chambers and extermination camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka. While those sites remain central, Bergen-Belsen demonstrated that genocide also includes abandonment. It includes the deliberate refusal to provide food, shelter, or medical care. It includes creating conditions where death is inevitable and then stepping aside. The camp also exposed the myth that mass death only occurs through rigid organization. Bergen-Belsen was chaotic, overcrowded, and visibly collapsing, yet it was still deadly on an enormous scale. This challenged the idea that genocide requires efficiency. Bergen-Belsen showed that chaos itself can be weaponized, especially when those in power refuse to intervene. Liberation made this reality undeniable. When British troops entered the camp, they encountered not a functioning institution, but a human catastrophe unfolding in real time. Thousands were still alive and dying all around them. This was not a crime scene frozen in the past. It was a living emergency. People were dying every hour, even after the SS had fled. Bergen-Belsen became one of the clearest examples of how long the effects of systematic neglect can persist, even after perpetrators are gone. Historically, this forced a reevaluation of responsibility. Who killed the prisoners of Bergen-Belsen? The guards who beat them? The administrators who ordered transports? The officials who refused food shipments? The answer was all of them and the system itself. Bergen-Belsen made it clear that genocide is rarely the work of a single act. It is the cumulative result of thousands of decisions that strip away care, accountability, and humanity. The camp also played a crucial role in shaping international responses to mass atrocity. Images and testimony from Bergen-Belsen influenced early discussions of crimes against humanity and contributed to the moral urgency behind post-war human rights frameworks. The idea that allowing people to die through neglect could constitute a crime became a foundational principle in international law. For historians, Bergen-Belsen remains essential precisely because it resists simplification. It cannot be understood as an extermination camp, nor dismissed as a wartime tragedy beyond control. It was both planned and chaotic, deliberate and collapsing. It sits at the intersection of ideology and failure, a place where the Nazi worldview continued to function even as the regime itself fell apart. Bergen-Belsen also challenges modern audiences to reflect on how societies respond to suffering. The camp was known. The transports were visible. The deaths were not hidden. And yet, until liberation, nothing stopped them. This raises enduring questions about responsibility, indifference, and the threshold at which inaction becomes complicity. In the broader history of the Holocaust, Bergen-Belsen stands as a warning against narrow definitions. It shows that genocide does not always arrive with orders to kill. Sometimes it arrives with orders to move people, to delay aid, to ration food, to ignore disease, and to accept death as an outcome rather than a crime. This is why Bergen-Belsen remains one of the most haunting sites of the Holocaust. Not because of what was built there, but because of what was allowed to happen there. It teaches us that mass death does not require innovation. It requires permission. And that lesson, perhaps more than any other, is what makes Bergen-Belsen impossible to forget. Chapter 6, Segment 2. The Aftermath, Survival, Death, and the Long Shadow of Bergen-Belsen. Liberation did not end the suffering at Bergen-Belsen. In many ways, it marked the beginning of another crisis, one that revealed just how deep the damage ran and how difficult it was to pull human beings back from the edge of systematic destruction. When British forces took control of the camp in April 1945, they did not step into a place that could simply be cleaned, reorganized, and healed. They stepped into a biological and humanitarian catastrophe that continued to kill for weeks after the SS had vanished. At the moment of liberation, tens of thousands of prisoners were still alive, but barely. Their bodies were ravaged by starvation, dehydration, typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and infections that had gone untreated for months or years. Many weighed less than half of what their bodies could sustain. Muscles had wasted away. Organs were failing. Immune systems had collapsed. Survival was no longer a question of freedom, but of whether the body could endure even one more day. One of the cruelest realities the liberators faced was that rescue itself could be deadly. Prisoners who had been starved for extended periods could not safely digest normal food. Many died from what doctors later identified as refeeding syndrome, a shock to the body caused by sudden nutritional intake. Even acts of kindness, such as giving bread or chocolate, could unintentionally kill those who had been deprived for too long. Every decision had to be weighed against fragile biology. The British medical teams worked under conditions that defied modern understanding of emergency care. They lacked supplies, personnel, and precedent. Entire barracks were filled with corpses stacked among the living. Typhus was rampant, carried by lice that thrived in filth and overcrowding. The disease did not stop at liberation. It spread among prisoners and threatened to infect medical staff and soldiers as well. Quarantine zones had to be established inside a camp that was already overflowing with sickness. Mass burial became unavoidable. Thousands of bodies lay unburied across the grounds, in huts, pathways, and open spaces. Bulldozers were used to dig mass graves, not as an act of disrespect, but as an emergency measure to prevent further spread of disease. These scenes, filmed and photographed, would later become some of the most iconic and disturbing images of the Holocaust. They were not staged. They were the grim mathematics of a place where death had far outpaced the ability to respond. Yet even as death continued, survival also began. Quietly, unevenly, and against all odds. Some prisoners, especially those who had arrived later or managed to secure slightly better conditions, began to stabilize. Medical tents were erected. Clean water was introduced. Clothing was distributed. Delousing stations were created to slow the spread of typhus. Slowly, the daily death toll began to fall. But survival carried its own burdens. Many survivors emerged from Bergen-Belsen without families, without homes, and without countries willing to take them back. Eastern European Jews, in particular, found that returning home often meant encountering hostility, violence, or communities erased by war. Bergen-Belsen thus became, temporarily, a displaced persons camp, a strange transformation from site of mass death to place of uncertain survival. Psychological trauma lingered long after physical wounds began to heal. Survivors carried memories of constant death, of watching friends disappear overnight, of being surrounded by corpses for months. Many struggled with guilt. Guilt for surviving when others did not, guilt for acts committed under coercion, guilt for the compromises made in order to live one more day. Bergen-Belsen had not only destroyed bodies, it had fractured identities. The camp also became a focal point for early documentation of Nazi crimes. Journalists, photographers, and investigators were brought in to record what they found. Survivor testimonies were collected. Medical examinations documented the effects of starvation and disease. These records would later play a role in war crimes trials and historical research. Bergen-Belsen was no longer just a camp, it was evidence. The British authorities quickly recognized that the camp itself could not be rehabilitated. The huts were infested, the ground contaminated, the infrastructure beyond repair. In an unprecedented decision, much of Bergen-Belsen was burned to the ground to stop the spread of disease. Barracks, fences, and structures that had housed unimaginable suffering were reduced to ash. This act was both practical and symbolic, an attempt to end the biological nightmare and to erase a space that could not be redeemed. But destruction did not equal forgetting. Even as the physical camp vanished, Bergen-Belsen entered global consciousness. It became a reference point for what happens when human beings are abandoned by systems designed to control them. Unlike extermination camps that were hidden and secretive, Bergen-Belsen had been allowed to rot in plain sight. Its existence challenged claims of ignorance and denial. In the years that followed, Bergen-Belsen influenced how the world understood responsibility for mass atrocity. The camp forced a recognition that genocide includes not only acts of killing, but acts of neglect. That allowing people to die through deprivation is not a lesser crime, it is a deliberate one. This understanding shaped legal definitions of crimes against humanity and expanded the moral framework through which mass suffering is judged. Survivors of Bergen-Belsen became witnesses not just to what happened there, but to how it happened. Their testimonies described a system where no single act caused death, but where every absence of care contributed to it. They spoke of hunger as a constant companion, of disease as an inevitability, of death as something so common it lost its shock. These voices ensured that Bergen-Belsen could not be reduced to statistics. Today, the legacy of Bergen-Belsen lies not only in memorials or museums, but in the questions it continues to raise. How far can neglect go before it becomes murder? How many people must look away before suffering becomes normalized? At what point does chaos stop being accidental and become criminal? Bergen-Belsen offers no simple answers, but it leaves behind an unmistakable warning. When systems remove care, accountability, and humanity, death will follow, even without orders, even without weapons. And once unleashed, that kind of destruction does not end the moment the gates are opened. It echoes long after. Chapter 6, Segment 3. Memory, Responsibility, and the Camp That Redefined Horror. Bergen-Belsen did not become infamous because it was designed as an extermination camp. It became infamous because it revealed something far more unsettling: how mass death could occur without gas chambers, without industrial killing schedules, and without secrecy. Bergen-Belsen exposed how neglect, collapse, and deliberate indifference could destroy human life just as effectively as bullets or poison. In the months and years after liberation, this realization reshaped how the world understood the Holocaust itself. Unlike camps such as Auschwitz or Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen left behind a different kind of evidence. There were no intact killing facilities to point to, no single mechanism of murder that could be isolated and blamed. Instead, there was a system of abandonment. Prisoners were starved not because food did not exist, but because it was withheld. Disease spread not because it was unavoidable, but because sanitation and care were intentionally denied. Death came not suddenly, but slowly, through exhaustion, infection, and despair. This made Bergen-Belsen harder to explain, but impossible to dismiss. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, Allied investigators struggled to categorize what they had seen. Traditional legal frameworks focused on direct acts of killing. Bergen-Belsen forced prosecutors, doctors, and historians to confront a broader definition of responsibility, one that included command decisions, logistical failures, and policies of neglect. It demonstrated that allowing people to die could be just as criminal as actively killing them. This understanding played a crucial role in post-war trials. The Bergen-Belsen trial, held later in 1945, was one of the first war crimes trials conducted by the Allies. Camp guards, SS officials, and administrators were prosecuted not only for violence, but for the conditions they allowed to exist. Testimonies detailed overcrowding, starvation rations, beatings, and the total absence of medical care. The trial established a precedent. Those who managed camps could be held accountable for deaths caused by neglect. Yet even justice came with limitations. Many perpetrators escaped punishment. Some claimed ignorance. Others argued they lacked authority or resources. Bergen-Belsen revealed how easily responsibility could be fragmented in large systems, how cruelty could be distributed across paperwork, orders, and indifference until no single individual seemed fully to blame. This diffusion of guilt remains one of the most troubling lessons of the camp. For survivors, memory became both a burden and a duty. Many struggled to speak about Bergen-Belsen, not because the violence was too graphic, but because the suffering was relentless and mundane. Hunger without end, disease without treatment, watching people die slowly beside you, day after day. These experiences resisted dramatic storytelling. They demanded quiet attention, the kind that history does not always give easily. And yet, survivor testimony ensured that Bergen-Belsen would not fade into obscurity. Voices like Anne Frank's, whose diary ended shortly before she perished there, became symbols of what was lost. Others spoke of the camp as a place where humanity was not stripped away in a single act, but eroded gradually until survival itself felt accidental. These testimonies shaped how future generations learned about the Holocaust, not only as an event of mass murder, but as a process of systematic dehumanization. The physical site of Bergen-Belsen today reflects this complexity. Much of the original camp no longer exists. The land is quiet, open, and sparse. Memorial stones mark mass graves. Pathways trace where barracks once stood. There is no attempt to recreate the camp as it was, because its horror lay not in architecture, but in what happened within it. Silence here is part of remembrance. Bergen-Belsen also reshaped global conversations about humanitarian responsibility. Images from the camp circulated worldwide in 1945, shocking populations that had not fully grasped the consequences of Nazi rule. These images forced governments and institutions to confront uncomfortable questions about neutrality, delay, and denial. Why had the camp existed for so long? Why had conditions been allowed to deteriorate so completely? Who knew, and when? In this sense, Bergen-Belsen became a warning beyond its time. It showed how crises worsen when systems fail to intervene, when suffering is normalized, and when victims are reduced to numbers. It demonstrated that genocide does not always announce itself with dramatic violence. Sometimes it arrives through shortages, overcrowding, and silence. The camp's legacy continues to influence how modern atrocities are assessed. Humanitarian law, refugee protection, and international responses to famine and displacement all carry echoes of lessons learned too late at Bergen-Belsen. The recognition that neglect can kill has shaped how crimes against humanity are defined and how warning signs are identified. But remembrance is not guaranteed. As survivors age and pass away, Bergen-Belsen risks becoming a footnote, overshadowed by camps that fit more familiar narratives of industrial killing. This is why its story matters. Bergen-Belsen reminds us that evil does not always operate efficiently. Sometimes it operates chaotically, carelessly, and still achieves devastating results. The camp stands as proof that cruelty does not require sophistication. It requires permission. Permission to ignore. Permission to deprioritize. Permission to treat lives as expendable. Once granted, those permissions can turn neglect into annihilation. Bergen-Belsen did not need gas chambers to become a site of mass death. It needed only time, overcrowding, and indifference. And that is what makes its history so unsettling, because those conditions are not unique to the past. They are choices, and they can be made again. This is the final truth Bergen-Belsen leaves behind. Not written in ruins, but in responsibility. Chapter 7, Segment 1. The Aftermath. Survivors, Silence, and the Struggle to Live. When the gates of Bergen-Belsen were finally opened, survival did not mean safety. For tens of thousands of prisoners still breathing inside the camp, liberation marked the beginning of another uncertain fight. A battle against disease, starvation, trauma, and a world that did not yet know how to receive them. The camp had ceased to function as a Nazi installation, but its legacy of neglect lingered in every body and every mind left behind. British forces moved quickly, but the scale of catastrophe overwhelmed even the most urgent efforts. Nearly every survivor was critically ill. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and starvation-related diseases were rampant. Many prisoners were so weak they could not stand, let alone walk. Some were blind from malnutrition. Others had lost the ability to digest food altogether. The human body, after months or years of deprivation, could no longer respond normally to nourishment or care. Medical teams faced impossible choices. Feeding the starving too quickly could kill them, a condition later known as refeeding syndrome. Doctors had to relearn how to save lives that hovered on the edge of collapse. Survivors were fed small portions, slowly increased, while sanitation systems were rebuilt almost from nothing. Entire sections of the camp were burned to stop the spread of disease, along with the clothing and bedding that had become lethal vectors of infection. Despite these efforts, death continued. Thousands died after liberation, not from Nazi violence, but from the irreversible damage already done. For many survivors, freedom arrived too late to undo what the camp had inflicted. Each death reinforced a painful truth. Bergen-Belsen did not stop killing when the SS fled. Its destruction had momentum. Those who lived carried wounds that could not be photographed. Psychological trauma manifested in silence, nightmares, and numbness. Survivors struggled with guilt. Guilt for having lived while others died beside them. Guilt for moments of desperation. Guilt for acts committed simply to stay alive. The camp had erased normal moral frameworks, replacing them with survival logic that did not fade easily. In the weeks following liberation, survivors were transferred to displaced persons camps, hospitals, and temporary shelters. Many had nowhere to return to. Families had vanished. Homes had been destroyed or confiscated. Communities no longer existed. For Jewish survivors in particular, return often meant encountering hostility, denial, or violence in their former towns. Bergen-Belsen had stripped them not only of health, but of belonging. Some survivors remained near the campsite itself. Ironically, Bergen-Belsen became one of the largest displaced persons centers in post-war Germany. Former prisoners lived on the grounds where they had nearly died, rebuilding lives amid mass graves and memorials. Schools, cultural centers, and newspapers emerged, acts of defiance against the attempt to erase them. Survival became testimony. The British authorities documented the camp extensively. Photographs, film reels, medical reports, and witness statements were collected with urgency. These records would later become crucial evidence, not just for trials but for history itself. Bergen-Belsen became one of the most photographed camps of the Holocaust, precisely because its conditions shocked even hardened soldiers. Yet public understanding remained incomplete. Early reports struggled to explain what Bergen-Belsen was. Some newspapers described it as a death camp, others as a prison camp gone wrong. The absence of gas chambers confused audiences accustomed to more defined narratives of extermination. Bergen-Belsen challenged simplistic explanations and forced a broader reckoning with how genocide operates. For survivors, telling their stories was never simple. Many felt that words failed. How could hunger be explained to those who had never starved? How could constant death be described without numbing the listener? Some spoke immediately. Others remained silent for decades. Trauma does not follow historical timelines. Children who survived Bergen-Belsen faced unique challenges. Many had no memory of life before the camp. Their identities were shaped by deprivation and loss. Some were adopted abroad, growing up far from their origins. Others struggled with attachment, trust, and fear throughout their lives. The camp did not end for them in 1945. It followed them into adulthood. Justice, too, felt incomplete. While some camp personnel were tried and punished, many escaped accountability. The sheer number of perpetrators, the chaos of post-war Europe, and political priorities of the emerging Cold War meant that countless crimes went unanswered. Survivors were left to reconcile survival with the knowledge that many responsible would never face consequences. And yet, remembrance began almost immediately. Survivors organized commemorations. Names were recorded. Graves were marked. Bergen-Belsen became not just a symbol of Nazi crime, but of post-war responsibility. The question was no longer only what had happened, but what would be done with that knowledge. Bergen-Belsen forced the world to confront a grim reality. Genocide does not require secrecy or efficiency. It can unfold through collapse, neglect, and indifference. It can occur when systems fail or are allowed to fail, and when human suffering is tolerated long enough to become invisible. For those who survived, living became an act of resistance. Every breath taken after Bergen-Belsen defied the system that had tried to erase them. Their continued existence was proof that the camp had not achieved total annihilation. But survival carried a burden, the responsibility to remember, and to make sure the world did not forget what neglect can do. Chapter 7, Segment 2. Justice Delayed. Trials, Accountability, and the Limits of Reckoning. In the months following the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, the question that haunted survivors and liberators alike was not only how such a place had existed, but whether anyone would truly be held responsible for what had happened there. The camp had no gas chambers, no industrial killing installations, no single command signed with explicit extermination orders. And yet tens of thousands had died in plain sight. Bergen-Belsen posed a difficult challenge to post-war justice. How do you prosecute mass murder when death was carried out through neglect, starvation, disease, and abandonment rather than direct execution? The British military authorities moved quickly to assert control. Former SS guards and camp personnel were arrested in the days following liberation. Some were found still wearing their uniforms. Others attempted to blend in with civilians or flee the area. A number were captured directly inside the camp, surrounded by the evidence of their crimes. Mass graves, skeletal survivors, and the overwhelming stench of death. For many British soldiers, there was no doubt that those responsible stood before them. What followed became known as the Belsen trial, one of the earliest major war crimes proceedings after the end of the war. Held in Lüneburg later in 1945, the trial charged 45 defendants, including camp commandants, SS guards, and female overseers, with war crimes committed at Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. Among them were Joseph Kramer, the last commandant of Bergen-Belsen, and Irma Gries, one of the youngest and most notorious female guards. The trial relied heavily on survivor testimony. Former prisoners described conditions inside the camp in painstaking detail. Starvation rations, overcrowded barracks, unchecked disease, beatings, and the daily presence of corpses. Many witnesses were still visibly ill, some testifying from hospital beds. Their accounts were often fragmented, emotional, and difficult to deliver, but together, they formed an undeniable picture of systematic cruelty. Prosecutors faced a legal obstacle. British law required proof of individual criminal responsibility. The defense frequently argued that deaths resulted from wartime shortages, not intentional murder. They claimed lack of resources, breakdowns in supply, and chaos caused by the collapsing German state. Some defendants insisted they had followed orders or lacked authority to improve conditions. Bergen-Belsen, they argued, was not designed as a killing center. The court rejected this narrative. Judges ruled that the conditions themselves constituted criminal behavior. Starvation, neglect, and deliberate failure to provide medical care were recognized as acts of murder when inflicted knowingly on prisoners under total control. Bergen-Belsen became a landmark case in establishing that crimes against humanity did not require gas chambers or explicit extermination orders. Systematic inhumanity was enough. The verdicts reflected both resolve and limitation. 11 defendants were sentenced to death by hanging, including Kramer and Grease. Others received prison sentences ranging from years to life. Some were acquitted due to insufficient evidence. For survivors, the outcomes were bittersweet. Justice had been acknowledged, but it felt partial, incomplete, and painfully narrow compared to the scale of suffering. Beyond the Belsen trial, accountability quickly thinned. Many lower-ranking guards were never prosecuted. Others reintegrated into post-war society with little consequence. As Germany rebuilt and geopolitical priorities shifted toward the Cold War, enthusiasm for extensive war crimes investigations waned. Survivors watched as former perpetrators resumed ordinary lives, often in silence and anonymity. This failure of comprehensive justice left deep scars. For survivors, the knowledge that those responsible might never face consequences compounded their trauma. Bergen-Belsen had stripped them of dignity and health, and the post-war world seemed unwilling or unable to fully acknowledge that crime. Justice, like liberation, had come too late and not far enough. At the same time, Bergen-Belsen played a critical role in shaping international law. Evidence gathered at the camp informed later proceedings at Nuremberg and contributed to the development of legal concepts surrounding crimes against humanity and genocide. Bergen-Belsen demonstrated that mass death could be caused by policy-driven neglect, and that such neglect must be treated as criminal. Yet legal language could not capture everything. Survivors often spoke of a deeper injustice, the impossibility of punishment proportionate to what had been lost. No sentence could restore families. No verdict could undo starvation, humiliation, or terror. Trials provided acknowledgement, but not closure. Public memory of Bergen-Belsen evolved unevenly. Early on, the camp became a symbol of Nazi brutality for the Allied world, widely photographed, widely reported. But as years passed, attention shifted toward camps associated with industrialized killing, such as Auschwitz. Bergen-Belsen risked being misunderstood, reduced to an anomaly rather than recognized as evidence of how genocide functions beyond gas chambers. Survivors fought against this erasure. They wrote memoirs, gave interviews, spoke in schools, and returned to the campsite for commemorations. They insisted that Bergen-Belsen mattered, not despite the absence of gas chambers, but because of it. The camp proved that mass death could result from deliberate neglect, bureaucratic indifference, and ideological dehumanization. Justice, they argued, was not only about punishment. It was about recognition, about naming what happened accurately, about ensuring that future generations understood that genocide is not always loud or sudden. Sometimes it unfolds slowly, through silence and abandonment. The legacy of Bergen-Belsen's trials is therefore conflicted. They marked an important step toward accountability, but also exposed the limits of post-war justice. They showed the world that cruelty without bullets could still be murder, and that the law must evolve to confront such crimes. For survivors, the struggle for justice did not end in courtrooms. It continued in memory, testimony, and refusal to let Bergen-Belsen be dismissed as a tragic accident of war. Because what happened there was not an accident. It was allowed. And remembering that truth remains a form of justice still unfolding. Chapter 7, Segment 3. Memory, Denial, and the Struggle to be Believed. When the trials ended and the headlines faded, Bergen-Belsen entered a new and quieter battle, the fight over memory. Liberation had revealed horrors so extreme that many struggled to comprehend them. Justice had named some perpetrators, but understanding, acknowledgement, and lasting remembrance proved far more fragile. For Bergen-Belsen, the danger was not forgetting outright, but being misunderstood, minimized, or quietly pushed aside as the world moved on. Unlike camps built solely for extermination, Bergen-Belsen did not fit the simplified narrative many wanted to accept. There were no gas chambers, no arrival ramps leading directly to death, no immediate mass executions. Instead, the camp killed through starvation, disease, overcrowding, and abandonment. For some, this made its crimes easier to doubt or worse, to dismiss as the unintended result of war. In the years after 1945, denial did not always come in loud declarations. More often, it arrived as skepticism. Questions were raised. Were the deaths intentional? Was it really that bad? Could disease alone explain what happened? Survivors found themselves forced to justify their suffering to a world eager for normalcy. Their bodies bore scars, but scars did not always persuade. For many survivors, this was a second betrayal. They had endured starvation, watched families die, and survived conditions designed to erase them, only to face disbelief afterward. Some were told they exaggerated. Others were met with silence. Trauma became something to be hidden, not spoken. The physical site of Bergen-Belsen reflected this uncertainty. In the immediate aftermath, the British buried the dead in mass graves and destroyed remaining barracks to prevent further disease. While necessary, this left little visible evidence behind. Grass grew over graves. The land appeared peaceful. Without ruins, denial found space to grow. For years, Bergen-Belsen existed more as an idea than a place. Memorialization was slow, fragmented, and politically complicated. West Germany struggled with how to remember camps located within its borders. Acknowledgement meant confrontation, not only with the past, but with complicity, silence, and inherited guilt. Survivors refused to let that silence settle. They organized commemorations, wrote accounts, and returned to the campsite year after year. They spoke not just of death, but of hunger, fear, humiliation, and abandonment, insisting that genocide was not only a matter of execution, but of deliberate neglect. Their testimonies challenged a dangerous myth, that genocide must always look the same. Bergen-Belsen proved otherwise. It showed that mass death could be achieved without sophisticated killing technology, that bureaucracy, indifference, and ideology were enough. As Holocaust denial began to emerge more openly in later decades, Bergen-Belsen became both a target and a counterexample. Deniers pointed to the absence of gas chambers as supposed evidence of exaggeration. Historians and survivors responded with documentation, death records, photographs, British military reports, medical data, and eyewitness testimony. The facts were overwhelming, but facts alone were not always enough. The struggle was never only about proving numbers. It was about defending meaning, about making clear that suffering inflicted through starvation and disease was not accidental, but intentional. That allowing people to die in filth and hunger was a choice, repeated daily by those in power. Education became the most powerful response. Bergen-Belsen was transformed into a memorial and documentation center, not as a reconstruction of horror, but as a space for learning. Visitors walked through fields marked with mass graves. Exhibits explained how the camp evolved, how it collapsed, and how death spread not through machinery, but through abandonment. Survivors often guided these efforts. They understood that memory required context, that without explanation, silence could be misinterpreted as peace. They spoke to students, soldiers, and officials, not to shock, but to warn. Their message was clear. What happened at Bergen-Belsen was not an exception. It was a consequence of dehumanization, a consequence of bureaucracy without conscience, a consequence of silence in the face of suffering. As the decades passed, survivors aged. Many died. With them went voices that could no longer speak firsthand. This made remembrance more urgent and more fragile. Memory now depended on records, education, and the willingness of new generations to listen. Bergen-Belsen stands today without barracks, without barbed wire stretching across the horizon. It looks quiet, ordinary, but beneath the grass lie tens of thousands who died waiting for help that never came. The danger now is not denial shouted from podiums, but forgetting whispered through indifference. Bergen-Belsen teaches a hard truth. Genocide does not always announce itself with spectacle. Sometimes it unfolds slowly, quietly, behind paperwork and excuses, while the world looks away. To remember Bergen-Belsen is to reject that silence. Not because the past demands it, but because the future depends on it. Chapter 8, Segment 1. The Survivors. Life after Bergen-Belsen. Survival did not mean freedom. For those who lived through Bergen-Belsen, liberation marked not an ending, but the beginning of another struggle. One fought not against guards or hunger, but against memory, loss, and a world that no longer felt real. When British troops opened the gates in April 1945, tens of thousands were still alive, yet many were barely clinging to existence. Their bodies were liberated before their lives were. In the days immediately following liberation, survival remained uncertain. Thousands died even after the camp was taken, their bodies too damaged by starvation, disease, and exhaustion to recover. Doctors worked around the clock, improvising treatment in a place designed only for death. They learned quickly that food itself could be lethal, that giving too much too quickly could kill those whose bodies had been starved beyond repair. Survival required restraint, patience, and medical care that barely existed. For those who stabilized, the next challenge was identity. Many no longer knew who they were supposed to be. Families had been erased, homes destroyed, entire communities vanished. Survivors asked questions with no answers. Where do I go now? Who is left? What does life look like after everything has been taken? Some remained near the camp for months, living in displaced persons facilities established by the Allies. These camps were meant to be temporary, but for many they became long-term holding places, spaces suspended between past and future. Survivors lived among others who carried similar trauma, surrounded by people who understood their silence without explanation. Yet even there, pain followed. Nightmares were constant. Sleep brought images of corpses, lice, hunger, and screams. Many woke in terror, convinced they were still inside the camp. Others could not sleep at all. The body had survived, but the mind remained trapped behind barbed wire. The world outside felt hostile in unexpected ways. Ordinary sights, a full table, a locked door, a uniform, triggered fear or disbelief. Some survivors hoarded food, unable to trust that hunger would not return. Others refused to eat at all, associating nourishment with sickness and death. The habits of survival were difficult to unlearn. Then came the problem of return. Some survivors attempted to go home, only to discover there was nothing left to return to. Houses were occupied by others. Neighbors were hostile, indifferent, or ashamed. Anti-Semitism had not vanished with the Nazis. In some places, it had hardened. For Jewish survivors especially, Europe felt like a graveyard. Many chose not to rebuild their lives on land soaked with loss. Emigration became the only path forward to Palestine, the United States, Canada, South America, or Australia. These journeys were often long, uncertain, and filled with bureaucratic obstacles, but they carried the promise of distance from the past. Yet distance did not mean escape. Bergen-Belsen followed survivors across oceans. It shaped how they raised children, how they trusted others, how they understood authority and fear. Many never spoke of what they had endured, not because they forgot, but because words felt inadequate or because silence seemed safer. Others felt compelled to speak. They testified at trials, wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and stood before classrooms describing starvation, disease, and abandonment. Each retelling carried pain but also purpose. Speaking became a form of resistance, a refusal to let the camp erase their humanity. Survivors often described guilt alongside gratitude. Guilt for living when others did not. Guilt for moments of selfishness that had kept them alive. Guilt that had no rational cause, but persisted anyway. Survival, they learned, carried its own burden. As years turned into decades, the physical effects of Bergen-Belsen lingered. Chronic illness, weakened immune systems, digestive disorders, and psychological trauma remained constant companions. Aging accelerated the return of memories. What had once been buried resurfaced with force. And yet, survival also produced resilience. Many survivors built families, careers, and communities. They loved, laughed, and created meaning in a world that had tried to deny them all three. Their lives became living evidence that the system of destruction had failed to erase everything. Bergen-Belsen did not end when the gates opened. It lived on in bodies, memories, and silence. Survival was not a moment, it was a lifelong process. To understand Bergen-Belsen fully, one must look not only at how people died there, but at how those who lived carried it forward into the world, into history, and into the responsibility of remembrance. Because the story of Bergen-Belsen does not belong only to the dead. It belongs to the living who refused to disappear. Chapter 8, Segment 2. Testimony, Trials, and the Struggle for Justice. When the gates of Bergen-Belsen were opened, the crime did not end. It changed form. What followed was a slow, uneven, and often painful attempt to confront what had happened there. Not only through memory, but through law. Justice, like survival, would prove complicated, incomplete, and deeply human. Almost immediately after liberation, British authorities began documenting the camp. Photographs were taken. Film was shot. Mass graves were recorded before they were filled. Survivors were interviewed while they were still weak, still sick, still unsure if they would live. These early records were not gathered for history alone. They were gathered because the scale of the crime demanded proof. The world, Allied officials understood, might not believe what had happened without evidence. Bergen-Belsen did not resemble the extermination camps of Poland with gas chambers and industrial killing centers. This horror was slower, less mechanical, but no less devastating. Starvation, disease, and abandonment were harder to explain and easier to deny. Within months, the first Bergen-Belsen trial began. Held in Lüneburg in late 1945, it was one of the earliest war crimes trials conducted by the Allies. 45 former camp personnel were charged, including SS guards, administrators, and female overseers. Among them were figures who had wielded immense power over prisoners' lives, and others who claimed they were merely following orders. Survivors took the stand. Many were still recovering physically. Some collapsed during testimony. Others spoke in flat, controlled voices, describing beatings, starvation, selections, and deaths as if recounting weather. Emotion, for many, had become dangerous. To survive the camp, feelings had been suppressed. To testify, they had to be summoned again. The court heard how food had been deliberately withheld, how medical care was denied, how disease was allowed to spread unchecked. Witnesses described corpses left among the living, guards who beat prisoners for sport, and overseers who enforced cruelty with casual authority. Bergen-Belsen's crime was not a single act, but a system of neglect engineered to kill. The defendants' responses revealed a pattern that would repeat across post-war justice. Many denied responsibility. Some claimed ignorance. Others argued that conditions were caused by the war, by shortages, by circumstances beyond their control. Few expressed remorse. Fewer still acknowledged the humanity of those who had suffered. Verdicts were delivered. Some were sentenced to death. Others received prison terms. A number were acquitted due to lack of evidence or unclear chains of command. Justice, survivors learned, was not absolute. It depended on documentation, testimony, and the willingness of courts to interpret suffering as crime. For many survivors, the trials brought mixed emotions. Seeing perpetrators held accountable offered validation, proof that what they endured was real, recognized, and condemned. Yet the limited scope of the prosecutions left bitterness. So many had participated, so few stood trial. Beyond Bergen-Belsen, the broader legal reckoning unfolded unevenly. The Nuremberg trials addressed the leadership of the Nazi regime, but countless camp guards, doctors, and administrators reintegrated quietly into post-war society. Some lived openly under their own names. Others disappeared into anonymity. Survivors were often asked to provide testimony repeatedly, for trials, commissions, historians, journalists. Each retelling reopened wounds. Yet many felt a sense of obligation. If they did not speak, who would? The dead could not testify. Silence, they feared, would allow denial to grow. And denial did grow. Almost immediately after the war, voices emerged questioning the scale of crimes, minimizing suffering, or reframing Bergen-Belsen as a tragedy of war rather than a crime of ideology. Survivors found themselves defending their own memories against skepticism. This struggle for truth extended beyond courts. It entered classrooms, newspapers, and family conversations. Some survivors spoke openly to their children. Others remained silent for decades, only breaking that silence late in life when they sensed time running out. Justice was not only legal, it was moral. It existed in recognition, education, and remembrance. Survivors understood that punishment alone could not restore what was lost. But memory could resist erasure. Bergen-Belsen became a symbol not just of Nazi cruelty, but of the difficulty of accountability after mass atrocity. The camp had killed through neglect and indifference, methods that blurred responsibility and complicated prosecution. Who was guilty when death came from hunger, disease, and overcrowding enforced by many hands? The trials offered no perfect answers, but they established something vital: that starvation can be murder, that neglect can be crime, and that obedience does not erase responsibility. For survivors, justice remained unfinished. Yet each testimony, each conviction, each preserved record pushed back against the silence that had once surrounded the camp. Bergen-Belsen had been a place where human life was allowed to disappear without consequence. The trials were an attempt, imperfect, incomplete, to insist that it mattered, and that it still does. Chapter 8, Segment 3. Memory, Denial, and the Long Shadow of Bergen-Belsen. Long after the trials ended and the graves were covered, Bergen-Belsen did not fade quietly into history. Instead, it entered a far more difficult phase, the struggle over memory. How the camp would be remembered, who would control its narrative, and whether the truth would endure became battles of their own, fought not with weapons, but with words, silence, and time. In the immediate post-war years, the site of Bergen-Belsen was not preserved as a memorial in the way many might imagine today. The camp itself had been largely destroyed after liberation to halt disease. Barracks were burned. The physical evidence of suffering was reduced to open ground, mass graves, and ash beneath the soil. What remained was absence, a landscape that looked deceptively peaceful. This absence made memory fragile. For survivors, Bergen-Belsen was never empty. It lived inside their bodies, in recurring illness, nightmares, and sudden sensory flashes. The smell of rot, the sound of coughing, the sight of eyes already resigned to death. But for the outside world, the lack of visible ruins made it easier to look away. As Europe rebuilt, attention shifted forward. Nations focused on recovery, economic growth, and political stability. The horrors of the camps became uncomfortable reminders of a past many wanted to forget, or at least soften. Bergen-Belsen, lacking gas chambers or dramatic industrial structures, was especially vulnerable to minimization. Some described it as a refugee camp gone wrong. Others framed it as a tragedy of war, not a deliberate crime. The language mattered. Words reshaped responsibility. Survivors encountered disbelief more often than sympathy. When they spoke of starvation, disease, and abandonment as intentional, listeners questioned whether the Nazis had truly planned such suffering. When they described guards who withheld food or ignored dying prisoners, they were asked for proof, as if cruelty required documentation to exist. Denial did not always arrive loudly. Often it came quietly, disguised as doubt. At the same time, former perpetrators and bystanders reintegrated into society. Many avoided discussion of their wartime roles. Families learned not to ask questions. Silence settled like dust over entire communities. For survivors, this silence felt like a second abandonment. Yet memory did not disappear. It persisted in fragments, in diaries written after the war, in testimony recorded by historians, in whispered stories passed between survivors who recognized one another by tattoo, accent, or shared grief. Gradually, efforts emerged to reclaim the site. Survivors returned, sometimes decades later, to walk the grounds where they had nearly died. Some stood silently, others wept openly. Many described a sense of disorientation. The land looked wrong without the barracks, wrong without the fences, wrong without the dead visible. But the absence itself became part of the lesson. Memorials were erected. Mass graves were marked. Informational displays were installed to explain what had once stood there and what had happened in its place. Bergen-Belsen became a space not of reconstruction, but of reflection, a deliberate refusal to rebuild what had been designed to destroy. Education became central to remembrance. Schools began bringing students to the site. Survivor testimony was incorporated into curricula. Historians worked to clarify Bergen-Belsen's unique role, not as an extermination camp, but as a place where neglect, ideology, and collapse combined to kill tens of thousands. Still, the struggle against distortion continued. As decades passed, fewer survivors remained alive to speak firsthand. With their numbers dwindling, denial and relativization found new opportunities. Some questioned numbers. Others shifted blame entirely to circumstance. A few rejected the crimes outright. In response, documentation became a moral shield. Photographs taken by British troops, film footage shown at trials, medical reports, burial records. Each piece of evidence stood in for voices that could no longer speak. Bergen-Belsen's legacy became a warning about more than Nazi crimes. It revealed how easily suffering can be erased when it leaves no dramatic ruins. How neglect can be dismissed as accident. How victims can be forgotten when their deaths do not fit familiar narratives. The camp also challenged assumptions about survival. Many of those liberated lived only days or weeks longer. Liberation for them came too late. This reality complicated comforting stories of rescue and redemption. Memory, survivors insisted, must include discomfort. Today, Bergen-Belsen stands as a place of quiet confrontation. There are no preserved barracks, no reconstructed watchtowers. Instead, there is open land, marked graves, and words carved into stone. Visitors are forced to imagine, and imagination, guided by truth, can be powerful. The long shadow of Bergen-Belsen stretches beyond Germany. It reaches into debates about responsibility, obedience, and the dangers of bureaucratic cruelty. It reminds the world that mass death does not require sophisticated machinery. It can happen through indifference, delay, and the steady erosion of moral boundaries. For survivors, remembrance was never about closure. It was about continuity. As long as the story is told accurately, as long as the dead are named and the causes acknowledged, Bergen-Belsen resists disappearance. The camp was once a place where people vanished without record, without dignity, without consequence. Memory is how that erasure is reversed. And the work of remembering, like justice, is never truly finished. Chapter 9, Segment 1. The meaning of Bergen-Belsen. What the camp revealed about modern evil. By the time Bergen-Belsen entered the final chapters of history, it no longer belonged only to the past. It became something far more unsettling, a mirror. Unlike camps designed solely for extermination, Bergen-Belsen exposed a different, quieter path to mass death. It showed how genocide does not always arrive through sudden violence or industrial efficiency, but through systems that decay deliberately, through neglect that becomes policy, and through institutions that abandon responsibility while maintaining control. In this way, Bergen-Belsen revealed truths that reached far beyond the Nazi regime itself. The camp demonstrated how modern bureaucracy could produce death without constant killing. There were no daily selections, no gas chambers operating on a fixed schedule. Instead, death arrived through paperwork, quotas, transport decisions, ration allocations, and medical indifference. Food shipments were reduced, then halted. Water systems failed and were not repaired. Medical supplies were withheld. Prisoners were transferred in overwhelming numbers, fully aware that the camp could not sustain them. Each decision appeared administrative. Together, they formed a lethal system. This was one of Bergen-Belsen's most disturbing lessons. No single action needed to be extreme for the outcome to be catastrophic. Responsibility was dispersed, diluted across offices, ranks, and departments. Guards could claim they never pulled a trigger. Officials could claim they followed orders. Doctors could claim there were no resources. Clerks could claim they processed forms. And yet, tens of thousands died. Bergen-Belsen exposed how moral collapse can occur without constant brutality. Violence was present, but it was not always visible. Much of the killing happened through waiting for food that never came, for treatment that never arrived, for liberation that came too late. The camp functioned as a holding zone where death was allowed to happen naturally, predictably, and continuously. This made the camp difficult for the world to understand. Many expected evil to look monstrous, obvious, and unmistakable. Bergen-Belsen looked disorganized, chaotic, even accidental. That illusion was dangerous. It allowed some to misinterpret what they were seeing, to mistake deliberate neglect for incompetence, intentional abandonment for collapse. In reality, Bergen-Belsen reflected Nazi ideology at its most revealing. Prisoners were not seen as humans deserving care, even at war's end. They were classified as expendable, burdensome, already written off. Their deaths required no urgency because their lives had no value within the system. The camp did not fail. It functioned exactly as such a worldview demanded. This realization forced a broader reckoning after the war. Bergen-Belsen could not be dismissed as an exception or anomaly. It fit too easily into the wider machinery of Nazi rule, one that relied on compliance, normalization, and gradual escalation. The camp illustrated how quickly ethical boundaries collapse when people accept categories that define some lives as lesser. For historians, Bergen-Belsen became a case study in systemic cruelty. It challenged simplified narratives of the Holocaust that focused only on extermination camps. It showed how mass death could occur even without explicit killing facilities, raising uncomfortable questions about how many deaths elsewhere may have followed similar patterns of neglect and abandonment. For survivors, the meaning was deeply personal. Many carried guilt for surviving when others did not. Some remembered stepping over bodies daily, knowing that indifference had become a survival mechanism. Bergen-Belsen forced survivors to confront the psychological cost of endurance, how prolonged exposure to suffering reshapes identity, memory, and trust in humanity. For the liberators, the camp shattered assumptions about victory. They had not expected to find such conditions so late in the war. Bergen-Belsen made it clear that the end of fighting did not automatically end suffering. Liberation was not a moment. It was a process, and one that came too late for many. As decades passed, Bergen-Belsen's meaning expanded further. It entered discussions about modern human rights, humanitarian law, and the responsibilities of states during crises. The camp became evidence that mass death does not always require overt violence, only sustained indifference backed by authority. This is why Bergen-Belsen continues to matter. It warns that systems can kill without appearing brutal, that suffering can be normalized through routine, that catastrophe can unfold slowly enough for people to adapt, until they no longer recognize it as catastrophe at all. Bergen-Belsen also revealed how easily the language of necessity can override morality. Shortages, logistics, wartime pressure, these explanations were offered repeatedly. Yet beneath them lay a fundamental truth. Choices were made, priorities were set, and lives were deliberately excluded from concern. In remembering Bergen-Belsen, the world is forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Evil does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wearing the language of administration, order, and inevitability. Sometimes it kills not through action, but through abandonment. The camp's true legacy lies here, not only in what happened, but in what it teaches about how easily it can happen again, wherever systems value efficiency over humanity and obedience over conscience. Bergen-Belsen stands as proof that genocide is not only an act. It is a process, and once that process begins, stopping it requires more than sympathy. It requires recognition, responsibility, and the courage to intervene before silence becomes fatal. Chapter 9. Segment 2. Memory, denial, and the long struggle to tell the truth. After the dead were buried and the camp was disinfected, Bergen-Belsen entered a second, quieter struggle, the battle over memory. The physical horror had been undeniable, captured in photographs and film, witnessed by soldiers and survivors alike. And yet, almost immediately, forces emerged that sought to soften, reinterpret, or distance themselves from what had happened. Bergen-Belsen did not only challenge the conscience of the world in 1945, it continued to challenge it for decades afterward. In the immediate post-war years, the scale of the Holocaust was still difficult for many to comprehend. The images from Bergen-Belsen were among the first to circulate widely, and for some, they were too overwhelming to accept. Denial did not always take the form of outright rejection. More often, it appeared as minimization. Claims that conditions were the result of wartime shortages, that chaos in the final months made tragedy unavoidable, that no one could have done more. These narratives attempted to shift responsibility away from ideology and policy and toward circumstance. Bergen-Belsen resisted these explanations. The evidence was too extensive. Survivor testimonies aligned with military reports. Medical records confirmed starvation and disease rates far beyond accidental failure. Administrative documents showed that authorities knew exactly how dire conditions were, and chose not to intervene. The camp's history made clear that neglect was not sudden. It was cumulative, sustained, and intentional. Still, memory remained contested. In the early years of Reconstruction, Germany faced enormous pressure to rebuild physically and psychologically. For some, confronting Bergen-Belsen threatened that fragile recovery. Silence became tempting. The camp was dismantled, its barracks removed, the land left largely empty. Without visible ruins, it became easier to look away. For survivors, this silence was devastating. Many returned home to find their families gone, their communities erased, and their suffering met with discomfort rather than understanding. Speaking about Bergen-Belsen often meant reliving trauma and risking disbelief. Some were told to move on. Others were met with indifference. The absence of gas chambers led some to falsely question the camp's significance, ignoring the tens of thousands who had died there. Yet survivors persisted. Through memoirs, interviews, and testimony at trials, they preserved what the landscape no longer showed. Their accounts revealed daily life in the camp, the hunger, the disease, the overwhelming presence of death. They described how bodies became part of the environment, how children grew accustomed to seeing corpses, how hope eroded not through sudden terror but through endless deprivation. These testimonies were crucial in confronting denial. They humanized statistics and challenged abstract explanations. Bergen-Belsen became not just a symbol of horror, but a record of lived experience. Each story reinforced the truth that mass death can occur even when killing is indirect, that systems can murder without explicit violence. Over time, Bergen-Belsen's role in Holocaust education expanded. It forced historians to confront the complexity of Nazi camps beyond extermination centers. It highlighted how genocide relied on a spectrum of mechanisms, from gas chambers to starvation, from shootings to neglect. Bergen-Belsen showed that the Holocaust was not a single method, but an adaptable system. This understanding reshaped how memory was taught. Bergen-Belsen became a warning about complacency, about how easily societies accept suffering when it is hidden behind procedure and distance. The camp illustrated how language can obscure reality, how terms like holding camp or transit camp masked conditions that guaranteed death. Denial, however, never fully disappeared. Even decades later, fringe groups attempted to downplay Bergen-Belsen, arguing that because it lacked gas chambers, it did not represent intentional genocide. These arguments ignored the overwhelming evidence of policy-driven neglect and ideological abandonment. They also ignored a central truth. Genocide is defined by intent and outcome, not by the specific tools used. The preservation of Bergen-Belsen as a memorial site became an essential response to these distortions. Memorialization transformed absence into presence. Visitors now walk across open ground marked by mass graves, guided by documentation rather than ruins. The emptiness itself speaks, a reminder that erasure was part of the crime. Education at Bergen-Belsen focuses not only on what happened, but on how memory is constructed and contested. It asks visitors to consider why denial emerges, why societies resist uncomfortable truths, and how easily suffering can be rationalized after the fact. In doing so, it places responsibility on the present, not just to remember, but to recognize patterns that lead to similar outcomes. Bergen-Belsen's legacy is inseparable from this struggle. It stands as evidence that truth does not preserve itself automatically. It must be defended against distortion, simplification, and forgetting. Memory, like justice, requires effort. The camp also challenges how people define responsibility. Bergen-Belsen was not run by a single villain. It functioned because many individuals accepted their roles, deferred moral judgment, and trusted that the system knew best. Remembering Bergen-Belsen means acknowledging that atrocity is rarely the work of monsters alone. It is often sustained by ordinary people who fail to question authority. In the end, Bergen-Belsen teaches that remembrance is not passive. It is an act of resistance against denial and indifference. To remember is to insist that suffering mattered, that neglect was a choice, and that silence is never neutral. As long as Bergen-Belsen is remembered honestly, it continues to speak, not only about the past, but about the responsibilities of the present. Chapter 9, Segment 3. Lessons from Bergen-Belsen and the Responsibility of Remembrance. Bergen-Belsen does not teach its lessons loudly. There were no factory-like gas chambers here, no single moment that defined its horror. Instead, its meaning unfolds slowly, through absence, neglect, and collapse. And that is precisely why Bergen-Belsen remains one of the most important sites for understanding how mass death can occur without overt spectacle, how genocide can emerge not only through direct killing, but through sustained abandonment. The camp forces a difficult realization. Systems do not need constant violence to destroy human life. They need only indifference structured into policy. At Bergen-Belsen, death came from hunger rations calculated too low to sustain life, from medical care deliberately withheld, from overcrowding knowingly allowed to spiral into epidemic. These were not accidents. They were decisions made incrementally, justified bureaucratically, and defended administratively. This is one of Bergen-Belsen's most unsettling lessons. The people who designed and maintained the camp did not always see themselves as killers. Many viewed their roles as logistical, clerical, or unavoidable. Responsibility was diluted across offices, departments, and chains of command. No single order demanded mass death, yet the outcome was mass death all the same. Bergen-Belsen reveals how moral responsibility can be obscured when cruelty is distributed. When suffering becomes normalized, it no longer shocks. It becomes background. Prisoners dying by the hundreds each day became figures on reports. Starvation became an accepted condition. Disease became routine. And because the process was gradual, it became easier to rationalize, easier to ignore, easier to explain away. This gradualism is central to understanding the Holocaust as a whole. Bergen-Belsen demonstrates that genocide does not require a sudden descent into barbarism. It can arise through policies that appear administrative, temporary, or pragmatic. Each step may seem survivable on its own. Together, they become lethal. For modern audiences, this lesson extends beyond history. Bergen-Belsen challenges the assumption that atrocities always announce themselves clearly. It asks whether suffering is only recognized when it is immediate and dramatic, or whether slow, systemic harm is more easily tolerated. The camp becomes a mirror, forcing viewers to examine how societies respond to suffering when it is inconvenient, distant, or hidden behind language. The responsibility of remembrance, then, is not only to honor the dead. It is to preserve clarity about how they died. Remembering Bergen-Belsen means rejecting comforting narratives, narratives that suggest chaos alone caused tragedy, or that imply good intentions failed under pressure. The truth is more disturbing. The system functioned as intended. It was designed to let people die. This is why Bergen-Belsen remains a warning rather than a closed chapter. Its history shows how easily ethical boundaries erode when human beings are categorized, devalued, and managed rather than seen. Once people are reduced to numbers, rations, and quotas, their survival becomes optional. Education at Bergen-Belsen emphasizes this point deliberately. Visitors are not shown reconstructed barracks or dramatized scenes. Instead, they are confronted with documentation, testimonies, and open ground. The lack of physical remnants forces engagement with the evidence rather than the spectacle. It insists on thought rather than shock. Survivor voices are central to this process. Their testimonies remind us that behind every policy was a lived experience. A body weakened by hunger, a mind eroded by fear, a life shortened by neglect. They speak of how death became ordinary, how hope narrowed to the next hour, the next spoon of soup, the next night survived. Their survival was not proof of the system's humanity, but of its failure to erase every witness. The responsibility of remembrance also extends to language. Bergen-Belsen exposes how euphemisms conceal reality. Terms like transit camp, holding camp, or evacuation masked conditions that guaranteed death. Remembering Bergen-Belsen means being vigilant about words, recognizing when language is used to distance responsibility or sanitize harm. In this sense, Bergen-Belsen teaches that memory is not passive. It requires interpretation, confrontation, and honesty. Forgetting does not happen suddenly. It begins with simplification, with selective emphasis, with silence. And once silence takes hold, denial finds space to grow. The camp also challenges the idea that only extreme ideologies produce extreme outcomes. Bergen-Belsen was not isolated from society. It was supplied, administered, and staffed by people operating within a broader system that valued efficiency, obedience, and hierarchy. Its existence depended on participation, active and passive, across many levels of society. This realization shifts the focus of remembrance from villains alone to structures. Bergen-Belsen asks not only who committed crimes, but how systems made those crimes possible. It asks how ordinary functions, transportation, rationing, administration, can be weaponized when morality is removed from decision-making. As the last survivors age, the burden of remembrance increasingly falls on those who never experienced the camps directly. This transfer of memory is critical. Without first-hand testimony, history becomes vulnerable to distortion. The responsibility then lies with documentation, education, and careful storytelling to preserve accuracy and meaning. Bergen-Belsen's legacy is therefore unfinished. Continues to demand engagement, not just sympathy. It asks whether lessons have been learned, whether warning signs are recognized, whether systems that dehumanize are challenged before they reach lethal conclusions. To remember Bergen-Belsen properly is to accept discomfort. It is to resist narratives that separate the past neatly from the present. It is to acknowledge that the conditions enabling mass suffering are not confined to history books. They emerge whenever people are reduced to problems, burdens, or statistics. Bergen-Belsen stands as proof that genocide can occur without dramatic moments, without obvious villains, without immediate resistance. It happens when cruelty is normalized, when responsibility is fragmented, and when silence outweighs conscience. And that is why remembering Bergen-Belsen is not optional. It is a responsibility to the dead, to the survivors, and to the future to recognize how easily humanity can be lost and how urgently it must be defended. Chapter 10. Segment 1 at the end of the camp and the beginning of memory. When Bergen-Belsen ceased to function as a Nazi camp, it did not truly end. What followed was not a clean transition from horror to peace, but a fragile, chaotic passage from collapse to remembrance. The final chapter of Bergen-Belsen's history begins not with liberation alone, but with the long, uncertain process of understanding what had happened there and deciding what responsibility the world would take for it. By April 1945, Bergen-Belsen was no longer a controlled institution. It was a vast, uncontrolled zone of death. The SS guards who remained were no longer capable of enforcing order, nor were they interested in preserving life. Their primary concern had become their own survival. As Allied forces closed in, many guards abandoned posts or blended into the surrounding countryside. Authority evaporated, but suffering did not. Inside the camp, tens of thousands of prisoners were trapped in conditions beyond endurance. Starvation had reduced bodies to skeletal forms. Typhus and dysentery raged unchecked. Water sources were contaminated. Sanitation had collapsed entirely. Death occurred constantly, in barracks, in open spaces, along paths between huts. There was no longer a system to record deaths, no structure to remove bodies, no capacity to care for the living. When British forces entered Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, they did not encounter resistance. What they encountered instead was something almost incomprehensible. The soldiers were not prepared for the scale or nature of what they saw. Piles of unburied corpses lay scattered across the camp. Survivors, barely recognizable as human, wandered aimlessly or lay motionless, too weak to react. The smell of decay permeated everything. For the liberators, the experience was deeply destabilizing. Many later described it as the most disturbing moment of the war. Bergen-Belsen did not resemble a battlefield or a prison. It resembled a landscape where death had overwhelmed all structure. The absence of immediate violence did not lessen the horror, it intensified it. This was suffering without spectacle, destruction without explosions, atrocity without a single dramatic act. Liberation did not bring instant relief. In many ways, it marked the beginning of another crisis. Thousands of prisoners were too weak to survive sudden changes. The act of feeding the starving became dangerous. Bodies that had endured prolonged deprivation could not process normal food. Medical teams had to learn, often through painful trial and error, how to stabilize survivors without killing them unintentionally. Disease posed an immediate threat not only to survivors but to the surrounding population. Typhus was highly contagious, and the camp had become a reservoir of infection. British authorities made the difficult decision to quarantine Bergen-Belsen. No one was allowed to leave. The camp was treated as a biological emergency zone, isolated from the outside world. Medical personnel worked under extreme pressure. Supplies were limited. The number of patients was overwhelming. Doctors and nurses faced ethical dilemmas daily: who to treat first, how to allocate resources, how to balance urgency against risk. Despite their efforts, thousands continued to die in the weeks following liberation. Freedom came too late for many. As emergency relief continued, another task emerged alongside medical care: documentation. British authorities quickly realized that Bergen-Belsen was not just a humanitarian disaster. It was evidence. What had occurred there needed to be recorded with precision. Photographs were taken. Testimonies were collected. Survivors were interviewed. The camp itself became a crime scene. This process was not abstract. Survivors were asked to recount experiences they had barely survived. Many struggled to find language for what they had endured. Trauma complicated memory. Hunger and illness distorted perception. Yet their testimonies were essential. They provided context that bodies alone could not. The physical camp posed another challenge. The barracks were infested with disease and decay. After careful consideration, British authorities decided to burn much of Bergen-Belsen to the ground. Entire sections were destroyed to prevent further spread of typhus. This act was necessary for public health, but it also meant that the physical site of suffering would largely vanish. This destruction created a paradox that would shape Bergen-Belsen's legacy. In order to save lives, the camp had to be erased. But in erasing it, tangible evidence was lost. Memory would have to rely not on preserved structures, but on documentation, testimony, and deliberate remembrance. In the immediate aftermath, survivors faced uncertain futures. Many had nowhere to return to. Families had been destroyed. Homes no longer existed. Anti-Semitism remained present in much of Europe, even after the war. Bergen-Belsen became, temporarily, a displaced persons camp, a place where survivors waited, healed, mourned, and tried to imagine lives beyond survival. For some, Bergen-Belsen became the last chapter of their suffering. For others, it was the beginning of a long struggle with trauma, illness, and loss. Liberation did not erase memory. It did not restore what had been taken. It merely opened the possibility of survival beyond the wire. As the camp faded physically, its meaning began to take shape historically. Bergen-Belsen was no longer just a place. It became a symbol of what happens when neglect is allowed to kill, when systems collapse without compassion, when human life is deemed expendable. The transition from camp to memory was not immediate or inevitable. It required intention. Without documentation, without testimony, without acknowledgement, Bergen-Belsen could have become just another forgotten name. Instead, it became a reference point in understanding how mass death can occur even in the absence of explicit extermination facilities. This is where the final chapter truly begins. Not with the opening of gates, but with the decision to remember, to record what happened honestly, to confront it without distortion, and to preserve its lessons beyond the generation that witnessed it. Bergen-Belsen did not end when the camp was liberated. It ended only when the world accepted the responsibility to remember what had been done there, and why it must never be allowed to happen again. Chapter 10, Segment 2. Justice, Responsibility, and the Struggle to be Heard. In the months following the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, the question that hung over the camp was no longer only how such suffering had occurred, but who would be held responsible for it. The silence left behind by the SS retreat demanded answers. The dead could no longer speak. The living carried testimony, but testimony alone was not justice. What followed was a difficult, imperfect attempt to impose accountability on a system built to evade it. Unlike extermination camps where killing mechanisms were explicit and centralized, Bergen-Belsen represented a different kind of crime. There were no gas chambers. There were no daily execution selections in the final months. Instead, death occurred through starvation, disease, neglect, and abandonment. A slow, bureaucratic annihilation. This made assigning responsibility more complex, but no less necessary. British military authorities quickly arrested remaining camp personnel. SS guards, administrators, and medical staff who had not fled were taken into custody. Many claimed they were powerless, that conditions had deteriorated beyond their control, that shortages and wartime collapse were to blame. These defenses would become familiar patterns in the years to come. The Bergen-Belsen trial, held later in 1945, was among the first war crimes trials conducted by the Allies. It preceded the more famous Nuremberg proceedings and set early precedents for how crimes against humanity would be prosecuted. 45 defendants stood trial, including SS officers, camp administrators, and capos who had participated in the camp's internal brutality. For the survivors who testified, the courtroom became another trial entirely. Many were still physically weak. Others carried profound psychological scars. Speaking publicly about their experiences meant reliving them. Yet their testimony was essential. They described beatings, deliberate starvation, indifference to suffering, and acts of cruelty carried out not in moments of chaos, but as routine behavior. The prosecution argued that even without gas chambers, Bergen-Belsen functioned as a killing site. The defendants, they said, had knowingly allowed conditions that ensured mass death. Disease did not excuse responsibility because neglect was policy. Starvation was not accidental, it was systematic. The collapse of sanitation was not unavoidable, it was tolerated. Some defendants were convicted and sentenced to death. Others received prison terms. A number were acquitted, often due to insufficient evidence or the difficulty of proving direct involvement. These outcomes frustrated many survivors. Justice, they learned, was constrained by legal frameworks that struggled to capture the full reality of what had occurred. The trials revealed an uncomfortable truth. Modern systems of law were not designed to address crimes of this magnitude. The scale of suffering defied conventional categories. Responsibility was dispersed across chains of command, paperwork, and institutional culture. Many perpetrators escaped accountability not because they were innocent, but because their guilt was bureaucratically diffuse. At the same time, the trials established a critical principle, that neglect could be a crime, that allowing people to die through deprivation constituted responsibility, and that obedience was not a defense. These ideas would shape international law in the decades that followed. Beyond the courtroom, survivors faced another struggle: being believed. In the immediate post-war years, much of the world wanted to move on. Reconstruction demanded focus. Political tensions shifted quickly into the Cold War. The full reality of camp life did not always fit comfortably into narratives of victory and recovery. Some survivors found that their stories were met with disbelief or discomfort. Others encountered silence. The absence of dramatic execution facilities at Bergen-Belsen sometimes led outsiders to misunderstand its brutality. How could a place without gas chambers be one of the deadliest camps? How could neglect alone kill so many? This misunderstanding added another layer of suffering. Survivors were forced not only to heal, but to explain, repeatedly, how starvation destroys bodies, how disease spreads in overcrowded spaces, how despair itself becomes lethal. They carried the burden of education as well as memory. In displaced persons camps, former Bergen-Belsen prisoners began rebuilding fragile communities. They created schools, newspapers, cultural groups, and memorials. These acts were not simply practical. They were acts of defiance against the attempt to erase them. Survival itself became testimony. For Jewish survivors, Bergen-Belsen also became a symbol in the broader story of displacement. Many could not return home. Families were gone. Towns had been destroyed or reclaimed by others. Anti-Semitism persisted even after the war. For some, the camp marked the end of Europe as a homeland. As years passed, Bergen-Belsen's physical absence made remembrance more challenging. Unlike Auschwitz, where structures remained, much of Bergen-Belsen had been burned. Memorialization required intention rather than preservation. Early memorials were modest, sometimes contested, sometimes neglected. It took decades for Bergen-Belsen to receive sustained historical attention. Only gradually did scholars, educators, and memorial institutions begin to emphasize its significance, not as an anomaly, but as a warning. Bergen-Belsen demonstrated that genocide does not require elaborate killing technology. It can occur when systems collapse ethically, when human beings are treated as surplus, when suffering is allowed to continue because stopping it is inconvenient. For survivors, memory was not abstract. It lived in bodies weakened by disease, in recurring nightmares, in the absence of families that would never be restored. Justice, when it came, was partial. Recognition, when it arrived, was late. But testimony endured. By speaking, writing, teaching, and remembering, survivors transformed Bergen-Belsen from a place of erasure into a site of responsibility. They insisted that the world confront not only what happened, but how easily it happened, and how quickly societies can adapt to cruelty when it is normalized. This struggle for justice, for acknowledgement, for truth, did not end with trials or memorials. It continues wherever history is questioned, denied, or minimized. Bergen-Belsen's legacy is not only about the dead. It is about the living, and the responsibility they carry to ensure that neglect, silence, and indifference are never again allowed to become instruments of mass death. Chapter 10, Segment 3. Memory, Warning, and What Bergen-Belsen Left Behind. As the years passed, Bergen-Belsen slowly shifted from a place of immediate horror into a symbol of something more unsettling and difficult to confront. A reminder that genocide does not always arrive with machinery, orders shouted in the open, or obvious moments of mass execution. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through abandonment, neglect, and the steady erosion of responsibility. What Bergen-Belsen left behind was not only graves in the earth, but a lesson etched into modern history about how mass death can occur without a single moment that feels decisive. Unlike camps that became fixed in public memory through iconic images of gates, chimneys, or preserved barracks, Bergen-Belsen remained largely invisible. Its physical destruction after liberation erased much of the visual evidence. What remained was testimony, documentation, and the memories carried by those who survived. This absence created a challenge. How do you remember a place that was deliberately erased? And how do you teach future generations about a crime that unfolded through systemic neglect rather than overt spectacle? In the decades following the war, memorialization at Bergen-Belsen evolved slowly. Early markers were simple and somber. Mass graves marked with stones, sparse plaques, understated language. There was no attempt to dramatize the site. This restraint reflected the nature of the camp itself. Bergen-Belsen was not theatrical in its cruelty. It was bureaucratic, killed by refusing to intervene. For many years, public attention focused elsewhere. Auschwitz came to symbolize the Holocaust in the global imagination, while places like Bergen-Belsen were sometimes misunderstood as lesser camps because they lacked industrial killing facilities. This misunderstanding obscured the reality that Bergen-Belsen's death toll, particularly in its final months, rivaled that of extermination sites. Tens of thousands died not because the camp was designed to kill them outright, but because no one in power cared enough to stop their deaths.
Historians gradually reframed Bergen-Belsen as significant.
They emphasized that it represented a different, but equally lethal face of genocide, one rooted in collapse, indifference, and the normalization of suffering. Bergen-Belsen demonstrated that once people are stripped of rights, food, shelter, and medical care, death becomes inevitable. No gas chambers are required, only time. This reframing carried important implications for how societies understand responsibility. Bergen-Belsen showed that mass death does not always require active violence from every participant. It can occur when systems are allowed to decay, when warnings are ignored, and when human beings are categorized as unworthy of care. The camp stood as evidence that moral failure is not always loud. Sometimes it is silent. For survivors, memory was not a matter of historical debate. It lived in their bodies and minds. Many carried lifelong health problems caused by starvation and disease. Others struggled with trauma that could not be easily articulated. Yet many survivors chose to speak, even when it was painful, even when they were met with disbelief or fatigue. They understood that silence was dangerous. Survivor testimony became the foundation of Bergen-Belsen's legacy. Through memoirs, interviews, court statements, and educational programs, they transformed private suffering into public knowledge. Their words replaced the barracks that no longer stood. Their memories became the architecture of remembrance. As Germany confronted its past more openly in the latter half of the 20th century, Bergen-Belsen assumed a more prominent place in national and international memory. Educational centers were established. Historical research expanded. The site became a place not only of mourning, but of learning. Visitors were invited not to observe ruins, but to reflect on absence, on what had been destroyed and why. This approach shaped how Bergen-Belsen is remembered today. The camp does not overwhelm visitors with reconstructed horror. Instead, it confronts them with emptiness. Open fields mark where thousands died. Simple markers identify mass graves without listing names, because names were lost. The quiet forces reflection. The lack of spectacle denies emotional distance. In this silence lies the camp's enduring power. Bergen-Belsen teaches that genocide does not always announce itself with dramatic imagery. It can unfold behind paperwork, supply shortages, and administrative indifference. It can thrive in environments where suffering is tolerated because intervening would require effort, empathy, or moral courage. This lesson extends beyond history. Bergen-Belsen warns modern societies about the dangers of dehumanization, bureaucratic cruelty, and moral disengagement. It asks uncomfortable questions. What happens when people are reduced to numbers? when responsibility is dispersed so widely that no one feels accountable, when suffering is acknowledged but accepted as unavoidable. The answers are not confined to the past. Bergen-Belsen stands as evidence that mass death can occur even when no one claims to intend it. It shows how systems can kill simply by failing to care. It reminds us that indifference, when organized, becomes lethal. For the victims, remembrance is not optional. Their deaths demand more than mourning, they demand understanding. Understanding how a camp that was not originally designed for extermination became one of the deadliest places in Europe. Understanding how collapse does not excuse cruelty. Understanding how silence enables atrocity. In the end, Bergen-Belsen leaves behind no grand structure, no dramatic ruins, no single image that defines it. What it leaves behind instead is a warning written in absence. A warning that when human beings are denied dignity, care, and recognition, death follows, quietly, relentlessly, and at terrifying scale. Remembering Bergen-Belsen means remembering not only what happened, but how easily it happened. And that memory, carried forward, is the last line of defense against its repetition.
Bergen-Belsen.
As this documentary comes to an end, we leave Bergen-Belsen not with the image of a single moment, but with the weight of what happens when humanity is allowed to disappear quietly. This was not a place defined by machinery or efficiency, but by abandonment, a camp where people were left to die because the system no longer cared whether they lived. Bergen-Belsen reminds us that genocide does not always arrive with sudden violence. Sometimes it arrives slowly, through neglect, overcrowding, hunger, and silence. It arrives when suffering becomes routine, when responsibility is passed along, and when human beings are reduced to a problem rather than lives. The victims of Bergen-Belsen were not killed by one decision, one order, or one weapon. They were killed by a collapse of conscience, by a world that looked away too long, by systems that failed and were allowed to fail. To remember Bergen-Belsen is to remember that cruelty does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it waits, and sometimes it succeeds because no one stops it. Tonight, as you rest, let this history remain, not as fear, but as awareness. Because memory is not only about the past, it is about protecting the future. Thank you for listening, and may those who suffered here never be forgotten.